In the shadows of ancient Athens, when the world was young and philosophy had not yet found its voice, a boy was born who would change the course of human thought forever. His name was Aristocles, though history would remember him by another name, a name that would echo through 25 centuries of civilization, inspiring kings and slaves alike, shaping empires and revolutions, building the very foundations upon which Western philosophy would stand. This is the story of Plato, the man who dared to ask what justice truly means, who wondered if the world we see is nothing more than shadows on a cave wall, who believed that somewhere beyond the chaos of earthly existence lies a realm of perfect forms and eternal truths. In a time when Athens burned with war and democracy crumbled into tyranny, when Socrates was forced to drink poison for asking too many questions, when the greatest minds of Greece wrestled with the deepest mysteries of existence, one man stood at the centre of it all, watching, learning, and ultimately creating a vision of reality so profound that we are still struggling to understand it today. This is not just the story of a philosopher. This is the story of how one man's search for truth became humanity's inheritance, how his academy would light the flame of knowledge that would never be extinguished, how his words would survive the fall of empires and the darkness of ages, speaking to us still with a clarity and power that time cannot diminish. Prepare yourself for a journey into the mind of genius, into the heart of ancient Greece, into the birth of ideas that shaped everything you know about justice, love, reality, and the human soul. Long before Plato opened his eyes to the Mediterranean sun, the city of Athens was already writing one of history's most extraordinary chapters. The 5th century before the Common Era had been a time of unparalleled glory for this small city, state perched on the rocky hills of Attica, surrounded by olive groves, and looking out over the wine-dark sea that Homer had sung about centuries earlier. Athens had stood against the seemingly invincible Persian Empire not once but twice, first at Marathon, where outnumbered Greek warriors had crushed the forces of King Darius, and then at Salamis, where the naval genius of Themistocles had turned the narrow straits into a graveyard for Persian ships. These victories had not merely saved Greece from conquest, they had awakened in the Athenian soul a burning pride, a sense of destiny, a belief that their city was chosen by the gods themselves to stand as a beacon of freedom against the despotism of the East. Under the leadership of Pericles, Athens had transformed itself from a military power into a cultural wonder, building the magnificent Parthenon that still stands today as a testament to classical beauty, attracting poets and playwrights and artists from across the Greek world, developing the radical idea of democracy where citizens gathered in the agora to debate and vote on the fate of their city. The tragic plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides explored the deepest questions of human suffering and divine justice, while comedy writers like Aristophanes used laughter to critique society and politics with a freedom that would have been unthinkable in any other ancient civilization. Yet beneath this golden surface, Athens was beginning to show cracks that would soon tear it apart. The democracy that Athenians praised so proudly was in reality a limited affair, restricted to male citizens, while women, foreigners, and the vast population of slaves had no voice in public affairs whatsoever. The Athenian Empire, built on the tribute of subject cities who had supposedly joined Athens as free allies against Persia, was increasingly seen as nothing more than a protection racket enforced by Athenian military might. Other Greek cities, particularly the stern military state of Sparta, watched Athens' growing power with alarm and resentment. The philosopher Heraclitus had already declared that war is the father of all things, and the Greek world seemed determined to prove him right. Tensions mounted year by year, until finally, in the year that would later be called 431 before the Common Era, the long brewing storm erupted into what would be known as the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that would drag on for nearly 3 decades and ultimately destroy the very foundations of Athenian greatness. This was the world into which Plato would be born, a world of glory and corruption, of brilliant achievement and coming catastrophe, of democracy and tyranny locked in mortal combat, a world where the old certainties were crumbling and thinking people were beginning to ask fundamental questions about justice, virtue, knowledge, and the best way to live a human life. Into this turbulent age came a new kind of teacher, men who called themselves sophists, meaning wise ones, who travelled from city to city offering to teach young aristocrats the art of rhetoric and persuasion for substantial fees. The sophists were the first professional educators in Western history, and they brought with them radical and disturbing ideas that challenged everything traditional Greek society held sacred. Teachers like Protagoras declared that man is the measure of all things, suggesting that there is no objective truth, but only individual perspectives and opinions. Gorgias taught that nothing exists, and even if something did exist, we could not know it. And even if we could know it, we could not communicate it to others. A nihilistic view that seemed to pull the ground out from under any possibility of real knowledge. Most controversially, the sophists argued that traditional values of justice and morality were merely social conventions with no basis in nature or divine law, that the strong naturally rule the weak, and that justice is nothing more than the interest of the stronger. These ideas were deeply threatening to traditional Athenians who believed in the gods, in absolute standards of right and wrong, in the sacred customs handed down from their ancestors. Yet the sophists flourished because they offered something that ambitious young men desperately wanted: the ability to speak persuasively in the democratic assembly and the law courts, the skills needed to rise to power and influence in a society where public speaking was the key to success. The stage was set for a confrontation between traditional values and radical skepticism, between those who believed in absolute truth and those who saw everything as relative, between the old ways and a new kind of thinking that would question everything. In the year 427 before the Common Era, or perhaps 428, the historical records being somewhat uncertain, a boy was born into one of the most distinguished families in Athens, a family that could trace its lineage back through generations of aristocratic ancestors to the very dawn of Athenian history, and even, if the family legends were to be believed, to the gods themselves. His parents named him Aristocles, a name meaning best renowned, though he would later receive the nickname Plato, possibly referring to his broad forehead or broad shoulders, or perhaps to the breadth of his intellect. And this nickname would stick so thoroughly that his birth name would be almost entirely forgotten by history. His father Ariston claimed descent from Codrus, the last king of Athens who had supposedly sacrificed himself to save the city from invasion centuries earlier, while his mother, Perictione, belonged to a family connected to Solon, the great lawgiver who had laid the foundations of Athenian democracy. This was not merely a matter of family pride. In ancient Athens, lineage mattered enormously, determining one's social standing, one's rights and privileges, one's entire place in the world. To be born into such a family meant access to the best education available, connections to the most powerful political figures, expectations of leadership and public service, but it also meant being part of a class that was increasingly viewed with suspicion by the democratic majority who saw aristocrats as potential enemies of the people, as sympathizers with Sparta's oligarchic system, as traitors who might betray Athens for their own class interests. The household into which young Plato was born was wealthy enough to own slaves who performed the manual labour, while the free citizens engaged in politics, warfare, and intellectual pursuits. His early childhood would have been spent in the women's quarters of the house, under the care of his mother and the female slaves and nurses, learning the basic stories and values of Greek culture through myths and legends that explained everything from the creation of the world to the proper way to honour the gods. When he was old enough, probably around age 7, he would have been turned over to male tutors and pedagogues who would begin his formal education in reading, writing, arithmetic, music, and gymnastics, the traditional curriculum for an Athenian gentleman. He would have memorized vast passages of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, learning not just the stories, but the values they embodied: courage in battle, loyalty to companions, respect for the gods, the importance of honor and reputation, the tragic reality that even the greatest heroes must eventually face death and loss. Music education meant learning to play the lyre and to understand rhythm and harmony, skills that Greeks believed were essential for creating harmony in the soul, just as musical notes create harmony in sound. Gymnastics meant training in the palestra, wrestling and running and throwing the javelin, building a strong and beautiful body that could serve the city in war and embody the Greek ideal of kalokagathia, the beautiful and the good united in one person. Yet the world outside the protected sphere of his wealthy home was anything but harmonious. The Peloponnesian War had begun just a few years before Plato's birth and would continue throughout his childhood and into his young adulthood, bringing grief and hardship to Athens on a scale that would have been unimaginable during the golden age of Pericles. When Plato was perhaps 2 or 3 years old, the plague struck Athens, a devastating epidemic that killed somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the city's population, including Pericles himself, the great leader who had guided Athens through its period of greatest glory. The plague was not just a medical disaster, but a moral and spiritual catastrophe, as Thucydides, the historian, recorded in his harrowing account of how the disease broke down all the normal structures of society, how people abandoned the sick and dying, how religious observances ceased to have meaning, how those who knew they were infected threw themselves into wild pleasure-seeking since they had nothing to lose, how bodies piled up in the temples and streets because there was no one to bury them properly. The Athens that emerged from the plague was a darker, more cynical place, less confident in divine favour, less certain of its destiny, more willing to use brutal force against its enemies, and even against its own allies who dared to rebel against Athenian rule. This was the atmosphere in which young Plato grew up, watching as the war dragged on year after year, hearing news of victories and defeats, seeing maimed veterans in the streets, listening to debates in the agora about strategy and politics, gradually becoming aware that the glorious Athens he had learned about from Homer and the old stories was perhaps not quite so glorious in reality. His father Ariston died when Plato was still a boy, and his mother Perictione remarried, taking as her new husband a man named Pyrilampes, who was politically active and connected to the democratic leadership of Athens. Through his stepfather, Plato would have had access to the world of politics and government, perhaps even meeting important figures and observing the functioning of Athenian democracy up close. Yet his family connections also pulled in another direction, toward the oligarchic opposition that believed democracy was a failed system that put power in the hands of an ignorant mob easily swayed by clever speakers. His mother's cousin Critias, and her brother Charmides would both later play prominent roles in the oligarchic revolution that briefly overthrew Athenian democracy, and these family connections would place Plato in an extremely difficult position, torn between different political visions, unable to fully embrace either the democracy that ruled Athens or the oligarchy that his relatives supported. This tension between democracy and aristocracy, between the many and the few, between popular rule and rule by the wise, would haunt Plato throughout his life and become one of the central themes of his philosophy. He was born into privilege, but lived in an age of war and social upheaval, raised with traditional aristocratic values, but forced to watch as those values seemed increasingly irrelevant in a world where power went to those who could speak most persuasively, rather than those who truly understood justice and wisdom. In this crucible of conflict and confusion, the young man who would become the greatest philosopher of antiquity was slowly being formed. As Plato moved from childhood into adolescence, his education became more sophisticated and demanding, preparing him not merely to be a cultured gentleman, but to take his place among the elite of Athens, who expected to play leading roles in politics and public life. Beyond the basic curriculum of music and gymnastics, he now encountered the great tragic and comic poets of the Athenian theatre, those extraordinary plays that used the ancient myths to explore contemporary moral and political questions with a depth and sophistication that has rarely been equalled in world literature. When he watched the tragedies of Sophocles, he saw how even good and noble people could be destroyed by fate and their own character flaws, how the gods might demand impossible choices, how the old heroic code of honour could clash with newer ideas of justice and democracy. When he listened to Euripides, whose plays were controversial for their psychological complexity and their willingness to question traditional values, he encountered characters who struggled with the same doubts and uncertainties that thoughtful people of his own generation were experiencing, heroines who challenged male authority, gods who seemed cruel or petty, traditional stories retold in ways that made them disturbing and problematic rather than comforting. The comedies of Aristophanes used crude humour and wild fantasy to satirize politicians, generals, intellectuals, and anyone else who took themselves too seriously, including the sophists and even Socrates himself, who was portrayed as a ridiculous figure running a think shop where students learned to make the weaker argument appear stronger and to deny the existence of the gods. According to later biographical traditions, the young Plato showed extraordinary talent in multiple directions, trying his hand at poetry and drama, excelling in gymnastics and wrestling, developing a passion for mathematics and geometry that would remain with him throughout his life. Some ancient sources claim that he wrote tragedies and even prepared to compete in the dramatic festivals, though he supposedly burned these youthful literary efforts after meeting Socrates and deciding that philosophy was a higher calling than poetry. Whether or not these stories are literally true, they reflect something important about Plato's intellectual range and his deep engagement with the cultural life of Athens. He was not growing up to be a narrow specialist, but rather a person of broad culture and multiple interests, someone who could appreciate poetry and mathematics, athletics and argument, the emotional power of tragic drama, and the logical rigour of philosophical reasoning. This breadth would later be reflected in his own writings, which are not dry philosophical treatises, but dramatic dialogues full of vivid characters, humour, mythic imagery, emotional appeal, and logical argument, all woven together in a unique literary form that had never existed before Plato invented it. Yet the most important element of his education was yet to come, an encounter that would transform his life so completely that everything before it would seem like mere preparation, and everything after it would be shaped by its influence. At some point in his late teens or early 20s, Plato met Socrates, the strange and fascinating figure who wandered the streets and marketplaces of Athens, engaging anyone who would listen in philosophical conversations that challenged their most basic assumptions about life, virtue, knowledge, and reality. Socrates was unlike anyone else in Athens, a stonemason's son who had fought bravely in the war, but now devoted his life to questioning people about things they thought they understood, demonstrating through relentless questioning that their supposed knowledge was actually ignorance, that they could not really define the virtues they claimed to possess, that their lives were unreflective, and therefore, as he famously declared, not worth living. He claimed to know nothing himself except his own ignorance, yet he possessed an extraordinary ability to expose the contradictions and confusions in other people's thinking, like a stingray that numbs whatever it touches, as one of his victims memorably described him. Unlike the sophists who charged fees for teaching rhetoric and relativism, Socrates took no money and claimed to teach nothing, insisting that he was merely helping others give birth to ideas that were already within them, like a midwife helping with the delivery of truth. He believed that virtue is knowledge, and that no one does wrong willingly, that there are absolute standards of right and wrong that can be discovered through reason, that the health of the soul is more important than wealth or fame or bodily pleasures, and that it is better to suffer injustice than to commit it, because injustice harms the soul of the perpetrator even more than it harms the victim. For Plato, meeting Socrates must have been like a thunderbolt, a revelation that changed everything. Here was someone who embodied an entirely different set of values from those dominant in Athenian society, who cared nothing for money or reputation, but only for truth and virtue, who could face down powerful politicians and famous sophists with nothing but questions and logic, who lived simply and frugally despite coming from a respectable family, who had a kind of inner strength and self-sufficiency that made him impervious to external pressures. Later traditions claim that Plato was only about 20 years old when he became associated with Socrates, which would mean around 407 or 408 before the Common Era. But he may have known Socrates earlier or later than this. What matters is that this relationship became the defining fact of Plato's life, the lens through which he would interpret everything else that happened to him, the foundation upon which he would build his entire philosophical system. In Socrates, Plato found what he had been searching for without knowing it, a living example of the philosophical life, someone who actually practiced what he preached, who would rather die than betray his principles, who demonstrated through his own existence that there was something higher and more important than political success or material prosperity. The young aristocrat, who might have become just another ambitious politician or wealthy gentleman, became instead a philosopher, a lover of wisdom, a seeker of truth, and this transformation would have consequences that would echo through the centuries. While Plato was discovering philosophy through his association with Socrates, the world around them was falling apart in ways that would profoundly shape his thinking about politics, justice, and human nature. The Peloponnesian War, which had already dragged on for more than 2 decades, was entering its final catastrophic phase, and Athens was about to experience a series of disasters and humiliations that would shatter the confidence and optimism of the Periclean age forever. In 415 before the Common Era, when Plato was perhaps 12 or 13 years old, Athens launched an enormously ambitious expedition to conquer Syracuse in Sicily, sending off a huge fleet, an army, with high hopes of quick victory and vast new conquests that would give Athens dominance over the entire Greek world. Instead, the Sicilian expedition turned into an absolute catastrophe, with the entire Athenian force either killed or captured, thousands of Athenian citizens either dead or enslaved in Syracusan quarries, a military disaster on a scale that Athens had never experienced before. The news of the defeat sent shockwaves through the city, sparking political upheaval and desperate searches for someone to blame, accusations of treason and incompetence flying in all directions, a sense that perhaps the gods had turned against Athens, or that the democratic system itself was fundamentally flawed. The war continued with Athens now on the defensive, struggling to maintain its empire against Spartan forces that were receiving financial support from Persia. The old enemy that Athens had defeated so gloriously decades earlier, but that now saw an opportunity to weaken the Greeks by backing Sparta. The democracy became increasingly unstable and paranoid, executing generals who failed to achieve victory quickly enough, listening to demagogues who promised easy solutions to desperate problems, oscillating between extreme measures and half-hearted compromises. In 411, just as Plato was entering young adulthood, the democracy was overthrown in a coup that established an oligarchic government called the 400, supposedly a moderate reform, but actually a brutal regime that quickly began arresting and executing its opponents. This government lasted only a few months before being overthrown and replaced by a broader oligarchy called the 5000, which in turn gave way to a restoration of the democracy. This rapid succession of regime changes, each accompanied by violence and recriminations, must have been profoundly disillusioning for anyone who hoped to see stable and just government in Athens. The democracy that prided itself on freedom and rule of law was revealed to be vulnerable to coups and manipulation, while the oligarchs who claimed to represent the better classes showed themselves to be just as brutal and self-serving as any democrat. Socrates, characteristically, maintained his independent stance throughout these upheavals, refusing to be co-opted by either side and getting himself into trouble with both democrats and oligarchs by insisting on principle over political expediency. During the time of the 405,000, he refused to participate in the illegal arrest of Leon of Salamis, defying the oligarchic government's orders, even though such defiance could easily have cost him his life. Later, under the restored democracy, he would again stand alone against the majority when he was the only member of the presiding committee to vote against the illegal trial of the generals after the Battle of Arginusi, where Athens won a naval victory, but the generals failed to rescue survivors from the water and were collectively prosecuted in an unconstitutional procedure driven by emotional mob fury rather than legal process. These incidents showed Plato and the other young men who gathered around Socrates that genuine integrity means standing firm even when everyone else is swept up in political passion, that justice requires respect for law and procedure, even when we are angry at supposed wrongdoers, that a truly good person must be willing to resist not only tyrants but also democratic majorities when they act unjustly. These lessons would be burned into Plato's consciousness and would shape his later political philosophy, his distrust of both tyranny and democracy, his conviction that politics requires wisdom and virtue rather than merely popular support or aristocratic birth. Finally, in 404, the long war ended with Athens' complete defeat. The Spartans and their allies blockaded the city, starving it into submission, forcing it to surrender unconditionally. The long walls that had protected Athens and connected it to its ports were torn down. The Athenian fleet was reduced to a handful of ships. The empire was dissolved, and Athens was compelled to accept a Spartan-imposed government. This new regime, which would be known to history as the 30 Tyrants, was led by Critias, Plato's own relative, and included Charmides, another family member, along with other aristocrats, who had long resented Athenian democracy and now saw their chance to reshape the city according to their own vision. At first, some people hoped that the 30 would establish a moderate oligarchy that would correct the excesses of democracy while preserving basic liberties and rule of law. These hopes were quickly shattered. The 30 turned out to be one of the most brutal and murderous regimes in Athenian history, arresting and executing supposed enemies of the state without trial, confiscating property to enrich themselves and their supporters, killing somewhere between 500 and 1,500 people in a matter of months, driving thousands more into exile, turning Athens into a city of fear and denunciation. Critias, the intellectual leader of the 30, was a former associate of Socrates who had absorbed philosophical ideas but used them to justify the rule of the strong over the weak, to argue that traditional morality was mere convention that the superior individual could transcend, to create a regime that sought to eliminate opposition through systematic terror. For Plato, this period must have been agonizing in multiple ways. His own relatives were in power, probably offering him opportunities to join the government and participate in the new order they were creating. According to Plato's own later account in his 7th letter, he was initially inclined to support the 30, believing that they would lead the city from an unjust way of life to a just one, but he quickly became disgusted with their actions and withdrew from any involvement with them. He saw how they tried to implicate Socrates in their crimes by ordering him to participate in the arrest of Leon of Salamis, an order that Socrates refused, even though such refusal put his own life at risk. He watched as his relatives and their associates revealed themselves to be not enlightened aristocrats, guided by wisdom and virtue, but rather thugs and killers motivated by greed and spite, and the desire for revenge against their democratic opponents. The old Athenian democracy had been far from perfect, prone to demagoguery and bad decisions and occasional injustices, but at least it had operated according to established laws and procedures and had allowed for debate and persuasion. The 30 showed what happened when such restraints were removed. When power was concentrated in the hands of a few who believed themselves above ordinary morality, when intelligence and education were divorced from ethical principle and used merely as tools for dominating others. This was a lesson in political philosophy more powerful than any abstract argument could provide, a demonstration written in blood and terror of what philosophy without morality could become. The reign of the 30 tyrants lasted only 8 months before it was overthrown by democratic exiles who fought their way back into Athens, defeated the oligarchic forces in a short but bitter civil war, and restored the democracy. The returning democrats might have been expected to exact terrible vengeance on those who had supported the 30, and indeed Critias was killed in the fighting, and many other members of the oligarchy were executed or exiled. However, the democratic leaders wisely decided that Athens had suffered enough from internal conflict and proclaimed a general amnesty, declaring that past political offences would be forgiven and that Athens would try to heal its divisions and move forward in unity. This was a remarkably civilized response to the horrors of the recent past, and it probably prevented further cycles of revenge and counter-revenge that could have destroyed the city completely. The amnesty meant that Plato and others who had family connections to the 30 were not persecuted for their relatives' crimes, allowing them to remain in Athens and continue their lives. For a moment, it seemed as though Athens might actually be able to put the trauma of war and civil strife behind it and rebuild some kind of stable and decent political community. But then, in 399, just 5 years after the restoration of democracy and 8 years after the end of the Long War, Athens committed what Plato would always regard as its greatest crime, an act of injustice so profound that it would forever shape his view of democracy and politics. Socrates was brought to trial on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth, accused of not believing in the gods of the city and of teaching young people doctrines that undermined respect for traditional values and authorities. The formal charges were brought by 3 individuals who seem to have had various motives: Meletus, a poet whom Socrates had probably offended; Anytus, a wealthy tanner and democratic politician who blamed Socrates for influencing his son to reject a career in his father's business; and Lycon, about whom little is known. Behind these individual accusers stood broader resentments and fears that had been building up around Socrates for years. Many people associated him with the sophists and blamed him for the moral and political corruption of various aristocratic youths, including Alcibiades, the brilliant but unstable leader whose treachery had contributed to Athens' defeat, and Critias, the leader of the 30 tyrants. The fact that Socrates was actually quite different from the sophists and had opposed both Alcibiades and Critias when they acted unjustly made no difference to his accusers. In the public mind, he was connected to these figures and therefore shared responsibility for their crimes. The trial took place before a jury of 500 Athenian citizens, a huge jury by modern standards, but not unusual in Athenian practice, where large numbers were thought to prevent bribery and manipulation. Plato was present at the trial, as he mentions in his dialogue Apology, which purports to record Socrates' speech in his own defence. Whether the Apology is a historically accurate transcript or Plato's literary reconstruction of what Socrates said or should have said, we cannot know with certainty, but it surely captures something essential about how Socrates conducted himself at this moment of supreme crisis. He did not grovel or beg for mercy or try to win sympathy through emotional appeals to his age and family, as was common in Athenian trials. Instead, he used the occasion to continue doing exactly what he'd been doing all his life: questioning, challenging assumptions, exposing contradictions, insisting on the truth regardless of whether it made him popular. He explained his philosophical mission by recounting how his friend Chaerephon had once gone to the oracle at Delphi and asked if anyone was wiser than Socrates, and the oracle had answered that no one was wiser. Socrates was puzzled by this because he knew he was not wise, so he set out to test the oracle by questioning people who were supposedly wise, only to discover that they thought they knew things they did not actually know, whereas he at least knew that he did not know. This was his wisdom, recognizing his own ignorance and trying to help others recognize theirs. As for corrupting the youth, he pointed out that the young men who followed him around were from the wealthiest families in Athens and chose to spend time with him of their own free will. And if he had really corrupted them, surely their fathers and brothers would be here accusing him. Regarding the charge of impiety, he insisted that he did believe in the gods, and in fact was serving the god by his philosophical activity, like a gadfly stinging a noble but lazy horse to keep it alert and active. Most provocatively, Socrates refused to compromise or concede anything to the jury's sensibilities. He declared that he was doing Athens a service and that rather than being punished, he should be rewarded with free meals in the Prytaneum, the public dining hall, where Olympic victors and other great benefactors of the city were honoured. He He said that if they executed him, Athens would be harming itself more than him, because they would be killing someone who was trying to improve them, and it would be hard to find another person willing to take on this thankless task. He made it clear that if they released him on condition that he stopped philosophizing, he would refuse to obey, because he must obey the god rather than human authorities. And as long as he had breath, he would continue questioning people and urging them to care for their souls rather than their bodies and possessions. This was magnificent courage and intellectual integrity, but it was not a strategy designed to win acquittal. The jury voted by a relatively narrow margin, perhaps 280 to 220, to convict him. Then, according to Athenian procedure, the accusers proposed the penalty of death, and Socrates was supposed to propose an alternative, after which the jury would choose between the two proposals. Socrates again refused to play the expected game, suggesting sarcastically that he should be rewarded rather than punished, then proposing a trivial fine before finally, at the urging of Plato and other friends, suggesting a larger fine that was still nowhere near proportionate to the seriousness of the charges. The jury, insulted by his attitude, voted by a larger margin for the death penalty. There followed a month during which Socrates remained in prison, while Athens observed a religious festival during which no executions were permitted. This gave his friends and followers time to devise plans for escape, and apparently they had bribed the guards and made all the arrangements necessary for Socrates to flee Athens and live out his remaining years in comfortable exile elsewhere. Plato would later write a dialogue called Crito, depicting a conversation between Socrates and his wealthy friend Crito, who had arranged the escape and who argued that Socrates had a moral duty to his friends and family to save himself, that his death would be a victory for his unjust accusers, that people would blame his friends for failing to save him. Socrates responded with a series of arguments explaining why escaping would be wrong, even though his conviction was unjust. He argued that one must never do injustice, even in response to injustice, that breaking the law would be doing harm to the city and its legal system, that by choosing to live in Athens his entire life, he had implicitly agreed to abide by its laws, even when they worked against him, that the laws had given him everything good in his life, and he could not now turn against them just because they had produced one unjust verdict. These arguments have been debated by philosophers ever since, but their conclusion was absolute. Socrates would not escape. He would accept the unjust verdict and undergo the unjust punishment, because to do otherwise would be to become unjust himself, and it is better to suffer injustice than to commit it. On the appointed day, Socrates drank the cup of hemlock poison and died surrounded by his friends, reportedly with perfect calm and composure, spending his last hours discussing philosophy, particularly the question of whether the soul is immortal and survives the death of the body. Plato was not present on this final day, being ill according to his own later testimony, but he would later write the dialogue Phaedo to record or imagine the conversations and events of that day, creating one of the most moving accounts of a philosopher's death in all of literature. The execution of Socrates was legally correct according to Athenian procedures, but morally outrageous from any deeper perspective. The killing of the best and wisest man in Athens by a democratic jury that could not tolerate being questioned and challenged. For Plato, this event was not just a personal tragedy, the loss of his beloved teacher and friend, but also a philosophical and political crisis that demanded explanation and response. How could the supposed city of wisdom and justice, the democracy that prided itself on freedom and rationality, have committed such a crime? The easy answer would be to blame democracy itself. to conclude that majority rule inevitably leads to injustice, because the many are ignorant and emotional and easily swayed by clever speakers. But Plato had also seen the horrors of oligarchy under the 30 tyrants, and he knew that aristocratic rule could be even more brutal and unjust than democracy. The problem, he gradually came to believe, was deeper than any particular form of government. The real issue was that cities were being ruled by people who lacked genuine knowledge and virtue, whether they were democratic majorities or oligarchic minorities or individual tyrants. What Athens needed, what any city needed, was not rule by the many or the few, but rule by those who truly understood justice and goodness and reality, who had the wisdom and character to govern well. This insight would become the foundation of Plato's political philosophy and would lead him to develop his famous and controversial theory that philosophers should be kings. After the death of Socrates, Plato found himself in an impossible situation in Athens. Though he was protected by the amnesty and had committed no crimes, he was closely associated with the executed philosopher and known to be a member of the Socratic circle. The city that had killed his teacher was no longer a place where he felt safe or welcome. Moreover, Plato was entering a period of deep mourning and reflection, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to understand how the tragedy could have been prevented, trying to figure out what a philosopher should do in a world where speaking the truth could get you executed. According to ancient biographical sources, Plato left Athens shortly after Socrates' death and began a period of travel that would last for perhaps 10 or 12 years, though the exact chronology and itinerary are uncertain and the ancient sources are often unreliable. What seems clear is that Plato spent his late 20s and early 30s visiting various cities and studying with different teachers, absorbing influences that would eventually be synthesized into his own unique philosophical vision. His first destination was apparently Megara, a small city-state not far from Athens, where Euclides, another follower of Socrates, had established something like a philosophical school. Euclides had developed his own interpretation of Socratic philosophy, emphasizing logical reasoning and the unity of goodness. And Plato would have found there a community of like-minded individuals who shared his grief over Socrates' death and his commitment to continuing the philosophical life. The move to Megara also had a practical advantage. It got Plato out of Athens during a potentially dangerous period, when anyone associated with Socrates might have been vulnerable to further attacks. Other members of the Socratic circle also scattered after the execution, seeking safety and trying to preserve and develop the legacy of their teacher. This dispersion meant that Socratic philosophy would not remain the property of any single city, but would spread throughout the Greek world, taking on different forms in different places, eventually evolving into various philosophical schools that would compete and argue with each other, while all claiming to be the true inheritors of Socrates' wisdom. From Megara, Plato may have travelled to Cyrene in North Africa, where he could have studied mathematics with Theodorus, a famous geometer who would later appear as a character in some of Plato's dialogues. Mathematics had always fascinated Plato, and his exposure to advanced mathematical thinking during these years would profoundly influence his philosophy. Unlike the shifting and uncertain world of political opinions and sensory appearances, mathematics seemed to offer access to eternal truths that were absolutely certain and universally valid. A geometric proof worked the same way whether you were in Athens or Cyrene or Sparta, whether you were rich or poor, Greek or barbarian, democrat or oligarch. 2 plus 2 always equals 4. The angles of a triangle always add up to 180 degrees. The Pythagorean theorem always holds for right triangles. This mathematical realm of eternal and unchanging truth provided a model for what philosophy should be seeking. Not the ever-shifting opinions of the many, but the permanent reality that lies behind appearances. The famous story that Plato later inscribed over the entrance to his academy, the words "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here," reflects his conviction that mathematical thinking was essential training for philosophy, teaching the mind to move beyond the evidence of the senses to the realm of pure reason and abstract truth. More controversially, Plato is said to have travelled to Egypt, spending time with the ancient priestly class who guarded millennia-old traditions of learning in astronomy, mathematics, theology, and medicine. Egypt had long fascinated the Greeks as a source of ancient wisdom, a civilization that had already been ancient when Greece was barely emerging from barbarism, a land of mysterious temples and hieroglyphic writings and elaborate rituals that supposedly concealed profound truths. How much actual influence Egyptian thought had on Plato is debatable and probably exaggerated by later writers who wanted to give Greek philosophy exotic and ancient credentials. But the trip to Egypt, if it really occurred, would have impressed upon Plato several important ideas. First, it would have shown him that Greek culture, for all its brilliance, was young and limited compared to the vast sweep of human history and civilization. Second, it would have demonstrated that different societies could have radically different political systems, Egypt being ruled by God, kings and a hereditary priestly caste, rather than by democratic assemblies or oligarchic councils. Third, it would have exposed him to the idea that truth might be preserved through secret traditions handed down within closed circles of initiates rather than through public debate and discussion. These themes, the antiquity of wisdom, the possibility of enlightened monarchy, the need for esoteric teaching reserved for those properly prepared, would all appear in Plato's later writings. During these years of travel and study, Plato was also, we can assume, beginning to write. The question of the order in which Plato composed his dialogues is one of the most vexed problems in classical scholarship, with experts disagreeing about chronology and different systems for grouping the dialogues into early, middle, and late periods. However, most scholars believe that some of the shorter dialogues, particularly those that focus on Socrates questioning someone about a particular virtue and exposing the person's inability to define it, probably date from this early period when Plato was still very much under Socrates' direct influence and trying to memorialize his teacher's method and personality. Dialogues like Euthyphro, which examines the nature of piety, or Larx, which investigates courage, or Charmides, which explores temperance, all follow a similar pattern. Socrates meets someone who claims to understand a virtue, asks them to define it, and then systematically demolishes every definition they propose, ending in aporia, a state of puzzlement and acknowledged ignorance. These dialogues do not offer positive philosophical doctrines or solutions to the problems they raise. Instead, they demonstrate the Socratic method of destructive questioning and the Socratic conviction that recognizing one's ignorance is the beginning of wisdom. By writing these conversations, Plato was performing multiple functions, preserving the memory of Socrates for future generations, defending his teacher against the charges of corrupting youth and impiety by showing how his questioning was actually morally serious and religiously motivated, and working through his own grief by recreating the voice and presence of the man he had loved and lost. The most significant journey of Plato's wandering years was his trip to Sicily and southern Italy, a journey that would involve him in political affairs with consequences that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In approximately 387, when Plato was about 40 years old, he travelled to southern Italy and Sicily, regions that were heavily colonized by Greeks and contained many wealthy and culturally sophisticated cities. In southern Italy, he made contact with the Pythagorean communities that still flourished there, secretive religious and philosophical societies that followed the teachings of Pythagoras, the semi-legendary sage who had lived more than a century earlier. The Pythagoreans held distinctive doctrines that must have fascinated Plato. They believed that number was the fundamental principle of all reality, that the soul was immortal and underwent reincarnation in different bodies, that certain foods and practices must be avoided to keep the soul pure, that the cosmos was harmoniously ordered according to mathematical principles, that philosophy was a way of life requiring discipline and communal support. Plato would absorb many of these ideas, particularly the emphasis on mathematics as the key to understanding reality, the belief in the immortal soul, and the notion that philosophers might form communities dedicated to the pursuit of truth and virtue. The Pythagorean influence on Plato would be profound and lasting, though he would always adapt Pythagorean ideas to his own purposes rather than simply accepting them wholesale. From southern Italy, Plato crossed to Sicily and visited Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city in the western Mediterranean, a wealthy and important place that was nonetheless politically unstable and morally corrupt in Plato's eyes. Syracuse was ruled by Dionysius the Elder, a tyrant who had seized power decades earlier and built Syracuse into a military powerhouse while brutally suppressing any opposition and living in luxury and suspicion behind fortified walls and bodyguards. Tyranny was the most hated form of government among Greeks, representing the complete perversion of political life, the reduction of the city to the personal property of one man who ruled entirely for his own benefit without law or accountability. Dionysius embodied all the worst features of tyranny: paranoid, cruel, sophisticated enough to appreciate culture and philosophy, but using his education only to more effectively dominate others, intelligent but utterly lacking in moral restraint. Yet despite his disgust with Dionysius, Plato found himself fascinated by the tyrant's brother-in-law, Dion, a young aristocrat who was philosophically inclined and seemed genuinely interested in learning about justice and virtue. Dion was wealthy, cultured, connected to power through his family relationship with Dionysius, and yet apparently troubled by the corruption he saw around him and searching for some better way to live and govern. Plato and Dion formed a close friendship, perhaps even falling into something like the educational relationship that Plato had experienced with Socrates, with Plato now playing the role of teacher to Dion's eager student. They discussed philosophy and politics, and Plato presented to Dion his emerging vision of what a just society would look like. A city ruled not by the strongest, or the richest, or the most popular, but by those who truly understood justice and goodness, philosophers who had been properly educated and whose wisdom would guide them to govern for the benefit of all rather than for their own selfish interests. Dion was entranced by these ideas and began to imagine that perhaps Syracuse could be transformed, that perhaps through philosophical education even a tyranny could evolve into something better, that perhaps he himself might play a role in bringing about this transformation. This was an intoxicating vision, and it would prove to be a dangerous one, leading both Plato and Dion into decades of political intrigue, failure, and ultimately tragedy. The friendship between Plato and Dion apparently angered Dionysius, who may have been suspicious of philosophical discussions and worried about their political implications. According to one ancient story, Dionysius arranged to have Plato sold into slavery during his journey back to Athens. Though Plato was fortunately recognized and ransomed by friends before suffering any permanent harm. Whether or not this dramatic tale is true, it seems clear that Plato's first visit to Syracuse ended badly and confirmed his sense that politics, as usually practiced, was hopelessly corrupt, and that philosophers who tried to reform existing governments were likely to be persecuted or destroyed. When he finally made it back to Athens after years of travelling, he must have been profoundly shaped by all he had experienced. The advanced mathematical thinking he had encountered, the Pythagorean communities with their disciplined philosophical way of life, the spectacle of tyranny at Syracuse, the inspiring but troubling relationship with Dion, who represented the possibility that philosophy might actually influence politics, but also the danger that philosophers might be destroyed by political involvement. Plato was now about 40 years old, no longer a young man following in Socrates' footsteps, but a mature thinker ready to establish his own philosophical project and create his own legacy. Upon his return to Athens, around 387 or 386, Plato took a step that would prove to be his most lasting contribution to Western civilization. He founded the Academy, the first true institution of higher learning in Europe, a school that would continue operating for more than 900 years until it was finally closed by the Christian Emperor Justinian in 529 of the Common Era. The Academy was established on a piece of property that Plato either owned or had access to in a grove, sacred to the hero Academus, located about a mile outside the city walls of Athens. This was not just a school in the modern sense, but something more like a religious community or philosophical society, formally organized as a theasos or religious association devoted to the Muses, the goddesses of arts and learning. By establishing the Academy as a religious foundation, Plato gave it legal protection and permanence. It was not dependent on his personal lifespan, but would continue as an institution with property, traditions, and ongoing membership. The Academy was open to students from throughout the Greek world, both men and women apparently, though the evidence for female students is somewhat uncertain. Unlike the sophists who charged substantial fees for their teaching, the Academy seems not to have required tuition, instead being supported by donations and endowments, though only relatively wealthy individuals would have had the leisure to spend years in philosophical study rather than working for a living. The curriculum at the Academy reflected Plato's conviction that proper philosophical education required systematic study of mathematics before moving on to philosophy itself. Students would study arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, understood as the mathematics of celestial motion, and harmonics understood as the mathematics of musical intervals. This mathematical training was meant to turn the soul away from the constantly changing world of sensory appearances toward the eternal realm of unchanging truth, to develop the capacity for abstract reasoning, to demonstrate that knowledge, which is absolutely certain and universal, is actually possible. Only after years of mathematical study would students be ready to tackle philosophical questions about justice, beauty, goodness, and the nature of reality. The Academy also engaged in what we might call scientific research, with different members investigating problems in mathematics, astronomy, biology, and other fields, though always with an eye toward philosophical implications rather than merely practical applications. This combination of advanced research and teaching would become the model for universities throughout the Western world, making the Academy the ancestor of every modern research university. The teaching method at the Academy seems to have combined formal lectures with informal discussions and debates, continuing the Socratic tradition of dialectical questioning, while also incorporating more systematic instruction. Plato himself did not simply repeat Socrates' method of destructive questioning that ended in aporia. He had developed his own positive philosophical doctrines that he wanted to convey to students, though he preferred to teach through conversation and writing rather than through dogmatic assertion. The dialogues that Plato wrote were used as teaching tools, read and discussed by students, serving as models of philosophical argumentation and as introductions to key concepts and problems. However, there is evidence that Plato also reserved certain teachings for oral instruction within the academy, doctrines that he considered too difficult or too easily misunderstood to be written down for a general audience. This distinction between exoteric teachings available to everyone through the written dialogues and esoteric teachings reserved for advanced students would become a source of endless scholarly debate, with some interpreting it as evidence that Plato's real philosophy was quite different from what appears in his published writings. The academy quickly became famous throughout the Greek world, attracting brilliant students who would themselves become important philosophers, mathematicians, scientists, and political advisors. Aristotle, who would eventually become the second most influential philosopher in Western history, joined the academy as a 17-year-old student and remained there for 20 years until Plato's death. Eudoxus of Cnidus, one of the greatest mathematicians and astronomers of antiquity, was associated with the academy. Speusippus and Xenocrates, who would succeed Plato as heads of the academy, developed their own interpretations and extensions of Platonic philosophy. Philip of Opus, Heraclides of Pontus, and many others whose names are now barely remembered by anyone except classical scholars, studied and taught at the academy, contributing to ongoing research and debate. The academy was not a cult demanding slavish adherence to the master's doctrines, but rather a community of inquiry, where disagreement and argument were expected and valued, where students were encouraged to think for themselves and develop their own positions, though always in dialogue with Plato's teaching. This openness to debate and revision would ensure that Platonism remained a living philosophy rather than a dead dogma, constantly evolving as new thinkers engaged with Plato's ideas and extended them in new directions. During this period of establishing the academy and teaching, Plato developed the philosophical doctrines for which he is most famous, ideas that would define Western philosophy for centuries and that continue to be debated by philosophers today. The most important and distinctive of these doctrines is his theory of forms or ideas, a metaphysical vision that attempts to solve the problem of how knowledge is possible in a world where everything is constantly changing. The theory of forms is not presented systematically in any single dialogue, but rather emerges gradually across many dialogues, with different aspects emphasized in different contexts, and scholars continue to argue about exactly what Plato meant and whether he modified his views over time. However, the basic outline is clear enough and represents one of the most ambitious and influential philosophical theories ever proposed. The problem that Plato was addressing can be understood through the kind of question Socrates always asked: what is justice, or courage, or beauty? When Socrates questioned people about these virtues, he was not asking for examples of just actions or courageous deeds or beautiful objects. He wanted to know what justice itself is, the one thing that all just actions have in common, the standard by which we judge whether any particular action or person or law is just or unjust. But where is this standard to be found? Not in the physical world, clearly, because nothing in the physical world is perfectly just or perfectly beautiful or perfectly anything. Every example we point to is flawed and limited and mixed with opposite qualities and will eventually change or decay. Moreover, people disagree about which things are just or beautiful, suggesting that if we rely only on sensory experience and opinion, we will never reach certain knowledge. Yet we do seem to have concepts of justice and beauty, and these concepts are not simply derived from experience, because experience gives us only imperfect examples. Where, then, do our concepts come from? And how can we have knowledge of justice or beauty if the physical world contains no perfect instances of them? Plato's answer is the theory of forms. Justice itself, beauty itself, goodness itself exist as eternal, unchanging, perfect realities in a realm beyond the physical world. These forms are not physical objects, but rather something like abstract universals, or archetypes, or essences. The form of justice is what all just things have in common, the standard by which we measure whether anything in the physical world is just or unjust. The form of beauty is what makes all beautiful things beautiful, the perfect beauty that particular beautiful objects participate in to a greater or lesser degree. The form of horse is the eternal essence of horseness that makes all particular horses be horses rather than cows or humans or rocks. Everything in the physical world is what it is by participating in or imitating the relevant forms. Physical objects are like imperfect copies or shadows of the perfect originals. Moreover, the forms are not just concepts in our minds, but real, objective entities that exist independently of whether anyone thinks about them. More real, in fact, than the physical objects we perceive with our senses, because the forms are permanent and unchanging, while physical things are constantly coming into being and passing away. This theory has profound implications for epistemology, the study of knowledge. If knowledge requires certainty and permanence, then genuine knowledge cannot be about the physical world, which is constantly changing, but only about the forms which never change. What we call knowledge of the physical world is really just opinion, belief, doxa, which may be true or false, but can never be absolutely certain because its objects are unstable. True knowledge, episteme, is knowledge of the forms, grasped not through sense perception, but through reason and intellectual intuition. The philosopher is someone who turns away from the deceptive world of sensory appearances and uses reason to ascend to knowledge of the forms, particularly the highest form, which Plato calls the form of the good, the source and principle of all reality and truth and value. This ascent is difficult and requires years of training in mathematics and dialectic, but it is possible, and those who achieve it become genuinely wise rather than merely clever or well-informed. Plato illustrates this theory through one of the most famous metaphors in philosophy, the allegory of the cave presented in Book 7 of the Republic. He asks us to imagine people who have been imprisoned in a cave since childhood, chained so that they can only look at the wall in front of them. Behind them is a fire, and between the prisoners and the fire is a raised walkway along which people carry objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners see only these shadows, and having never seen anything else, take the shadows to be reality itself. Now suppose one prisoner is freed and forced to turn around and see the fire and the objects casting shadows. At first he would be confused and pained by the bright light, but gradually he would realize that these objects are more real than the shadows he had been watching. Then suppose he is dragged out of the cave entirely into the sunlight. Again he would be overwhelmed, but eventually he would adjust and see the real world in all its richness and colour, and finally he would be able to look at the sun itself, the source of light that makes everything visible. This prisoner represents the philosopher who, through education and effort, ascends from the darkness of ignorance to the light of knowledge, from the shadows of physical appearances to the forms themselves, and finally to the form of the good, which is like the sun, the source of all truth and reality. The tragedy is that if this enlightened person returns to the cave to free the other prisoners, they will not believe him, but will think he is crazy, and they may even kill him if he tries to force them to leave their comfortable illusions. This last part clearly refers to Socrates, the philosopher who tried to enlighten Athens and was executed for his efforts. The theory of forms is simultaneously profound and problematic, which is why philosophers have been arguing about it for more than 2 millennia. It seems to solve certain problems. It explains how knowledge is possible. It provides objective standards for moral and aesthetic judgment. It accounts for the unity and stability underlying diversity and change. But it also raises new problems. How exactly do physical things participate in forms? Are there forms for everything, including ugly or evil things? If the forms are separate from the physical world, how can we know them? How do we explain the relationship between multiple forms? Aristotle, Plato's own student, would mount a systematic critique of the theory of forms, arguing that it multiplies entities unnecessarily and fails to explain how forms can cause anything in the physical world. Yet even critics have to acknowledge that Plato identified real philosophical problems and offered a solution that, however flawed, demonstrates the power and ambition of systematic philosophical thinking. Plato's most famous and controversial work is The Republic, a long dialogue in 10 books that addresses the question of what justice is and whether the just person is happier than the unjust person. The dialogue begins with Socrates in conversation with various people who propose and defend different definitions of justice. Justice is telling the truth and paying what you owe. Justice is helping friends and harming enemies. Justice is the interest of the stronger. Justice is whatever you can get away with when no one is watching. Socrates systematically demolishes each of these proposals, showing their contradictions and absurdities, until his interlocutors challenge him to not merely criticize, but to explain what justice really is and to prove that being just is better than being unjust, even if you could commit injustice with complete impunity. This challenge leads Socrates to propose that they should look at justice not first in the individual person, where it is small and hard to see, but in the city where it is written large and easier to examine, and that once they understand what makes a city just, they can apply those lessons to the individual soul. This proposal launches one of the most ambitious thought experiments in political philosophy, the construction in speech of an ideal city that would be perfectly just. Socrates builds up this city step by step, starting from basic human needs for food, shelter, and clothing, adding craftsmen and farmers and traders, then adding guardians to protect the city from external enemies, and finally dividing the guardians into 2 classes: the warriors who do the actual fighting and the rulers who govern the city. Each class has its proper function. The producers create the material goods needed for life. The warriors defend the city, and the rulers make decisions and establish laws. Justice in the city consists in each class performing its proper function and not interfering with the others, a harmonious arrangement where everyone does what they are naturally suited to do, and the different parts work together for the common good. The rulers must be philosophers who have studied mathematics and dialectic and ascended to knowledge of the forms, particularly the form of the good, so that they govern based on wisdom rather than opinion or self-interest. The warriors must be spirited and brave, educated in music and gymnastics to develop both courage and gentleness, capable of fighting fiercely against enemies while being gentle to their own people. The producers need only the virtue of moderation, accepting the rule of those wiser than themselves and focusing on their craft. This vision of the just city leads Plato to propose a series of radical social arrangements that have shocked and fascinated readers for centuries. The guardians, both the warriors and the rulers, must have no private property or private families. They will live in common housing, eat in common messes, receive stipends sufficient for their needs, but not enough to make them wealthy, and not own gold or silver or any private possessions beyond what is absolutely necessary. Their children will be raised communally, taken from their mothers at birth and raised by the state, so that no parent knows which children are theirs, and no child knows who their parents are, creating a situation where the guardians see the entire city as their family and care for all citizens as relatives. Mating among the guardians will be controlled by the rulers through rigged lotteries that make people think they are choosing their partners by chance, but actually pair them according to eugenic principles to breed the best possible offspring, with inferior children exposed or hidden away, and superior children given the best education. Women of the guardian class will receive the same education and training as men, and will serve as warriors and rulers alongside men, since Plato argues that the only relevant difference between men and women is in reproduction, and that some women are naturally suited to be warriors or rulers, just as some men are. This equality of women in the guardian class was an extraordinarily progressive idea for ancient Greece, where women were typically confined to the household and excluded from public life, though we should note that it applies only to the guardians, and that the female producers presumably remain in traditional gender roles. The education of the guardians is described in great detail and reflects Plato's deep concern with how culture shapes character. The young guardians must be carefully shielded from bad influences, which means censoring the traditional myths and poems that portrayed the gods as quarrelling and deceiving and committing adultery and other immoral acts. Homer and Hesiod must be edited or banned because they give false images of the gods and might teach children that bad behaviour is acceptable. Only stories that portray gods as good and humans as responsible for their own choices should be allowed. Music must be regulated because different rhythms and modes have different effects on the soul, some producing courage and moderation, while others produce softness and license. The physical training in gymnastics must be balanced with intellectual training so that the guardians are neither brutish and violent like soldiers who know only fighting, nor soft and weak like intellectuals who neglect their bodies. The goal is to produce individuals who are harmoniously balanced, with spirited and rational elements properly developed and coordinated, neither excessively aggressive nor excessively gentle, but capable of both as circumstances require. The culmination of guardian education is the study of philosophy, but this is not open to everyone, and does not begin until the student is mature enough to handle it. Plato insists that dialectical training in questioning and argument must not be given to the young, because they will misuse it, treating philosophy as a game of refutation and becoming confused about values and falling into relativism and cynicism. Only those who have proven themselves stable in character and successfully completed years of mathematical study should be introduced to dialectic around age 30, and even then only the best of these should continue to the highest level of philosophical education that culminates in direct intellectual apprehension of the form of the good. Those few who achieve this highest knowledge around age 50 will become the philosopher kings who rule the city, though they will do so reluctantly because they would prefer to spend their time in philosophical contemplation rather than in the messy business of politics. This reluctance is actually crucial. Those who desire power should not have it, while those who have to be compelled to rule are the only ones who can be trusted with power, because they will exercise it for the city's benefit rather than their own. Having constructed this ideal city, Socrates then applies its structure to the individual human soul. Just as the city has three classes, the soul has three parts. The rational part that seeks truth and makes decisions, the spirited part that feels anger and pride and responds to challenges, and the appetitive part that desires food, drink, sex, and other bodily pleasures. Justice in the individual consists in each part of the soul performing its proper function under the rule of reason, with spirit supporting reason's decisions and appetite being controlled by both reason and spirit. The just person is one whose soul is harmoniously ordered, with reason ruling, spirit fighting for what reason judges right, and appetites kept within appropriate bounds. Plato argues that such a person will necessarily be happier than the unjust person whose soul is disordered, with appetite or spirit usurping the rule that properly belongs to reason, even if the unjust person appears successful and prosperous from an external perspective. The inner harmony of the just soul is intrinsically valuable and produces true happiness, while the disorder of the unjust soul produces inner conflict and misery, no matter how much wealth or power the person possesses externally. The later books of the Republic developed two lines of thought that have made Plato one of the most controversial philosophers in Western history: his critique of democracy and his critique of poetry and art. Plato describes 5 types of political systems arranged in order from best to worst. Aristocracy, which is the rule of the best and means the ideal city ruled by philosopher kings. Timocracy, which is rule based on honour and military prowess like Sparta. Oligarchy, which is rule by the wealthy few. Democracy, which is rule by the people. And tyranny, which is rule by one person for his own benefit. Each of these forms of government corresponds to a type of human soul, and Plato traces how cities and souls progressively degenerate from better to worse forms, showing how aristocracy decays into timocracy when the guardians start to care more about honour than wisdom, how timocracy decays into oligarchy when honour is replaced by greed for wealth, how oligarchy decays into democracy when the poor rise up against the rich, and how democracy finally decays into tyranny when freedom becomes license and people crave a strong leader to restore order. Plato's portrait of democracy is fascinating and disturbing, combining genuine insight with aristocratic prejudice. He describes democratic society as characterized by freedom and equality, where everyone does as they please, with no authority structure compelling obedience, where people pursue whatever desires they happen to have without discrimination between higher and lower pleasures, where sons disrespect fathers and students disrespect teachers and slaves act as free as their masters, where public offices are distributed by lot so that any ignorant person might end up in a position of power, where clever speakers sway the assembly through flattery and emotional appeals rather than reason, where the rich are resented and the poor are praised simply for being poor, where diversity is celebrated to such an extent that there is no common culture or shared values to hold the city together. Initially, this seems pleasant and attractive, a city where everyone is free to live as they choose. But Plato argues that such unlimited freedom is actually the worst slavery, because it makes people the slaves of their own undisciplined appetites. The democratic person is someone who has no stable character or values, but simply pursues whatever desire is strongest at the moment, spending money on wine and parties one day, and then switching to exercise and philosophy the next, then to politics, then to business, constantly changing with no coherent life plan or hierarchy of values. Moreover, Democratic freedom inevitably produces inequality because people with different abilities and levels of self-discipline will achieve different results, leading to resentment and class conflict. And this conflict will eventually lead the demos to elevate a demagogue who promises to protect the people, but who actually uses popular support to establish himself as a tyrant. This critique of democracy reflects Plato's direct experience of late 5th century Athens, where democracy had prosecuted the generals after Arginusi in an illegal proceeding, where clever speakers had persuaded the assembly to launch the disastrous Sicilian expedition, where Socrates had been convicted and executed by a jury of democratic citizens. Plato saw democracy as mob rule, a system where the ignorant many make decisions they are not competent to make, where popularity matters more than wisdom, where freedom means nothing more than doing whatever you feel like doing without reference to any objective standard of right and wrong. Yet we should also recognize that Plato's critique is profoundly elitist and anti-egalitarian, assuming that most people are incapable of rational self-government and need to be ruled by a wise elite for their own good. This assumption has been used throughout history to justify every kind of authoritarian regime, and many defenders of democracy have argued that Plato fundamentally misunderstood both the nature of political wisdom and the capacity of ordinary people to govern themselves reasonably well when given proper institutions and education. Plato's critique of poetry and art is equally controversial and has made him the enemy of artists and literary people from his own time to ours. He argues that poets and painters should be banned from the ideal city because they produce imitations that are twice removed from reality and that have morally corrupting effects on their audiences. To understand this critique, we need to remember Plato's theory of forms. The carpenter who makes a bed is imitating the form of bed, the eternal and perfect idea of what a bed is. The painter who paints a picture of the bed is imitating the carpenter's bed, thus producing an imitation of an imitation, 3 steps removed from true reality. Moreover, the painter's imitation is superficial, showing only how the bed appears from one angle rather than capturing what a bed really is. This applies to all art. It deals with appearances rather than reality, with images rather than the things themselves, and therefore leads people away from truth rather than toward what. Even worse, poetry has dangerous emotional effects, particularly tragic drama, which evokes pity and fear and makes people weep for fictional characters, thus strengthening the emotional part of the soul that should be controlled by reason. When we watch Achilles lamenting the death of Patroclus or Oedipus discovering his horrible fate, we sympathize with their grief and lose ourselves in emotion, and this exercise in emotional indulgence carries over into our own lives, making us less rational and self-controlled. Furthermore, Plato notes that poets claim to have wisdom about all sorts of subjects, from warfare to craftsmanship to morality, but actually they have no real knowledge of these things and simply create convincing illusions. Homer is revered as the teacher of Greece, but what did Homer really know about generalship or statesmanship or virtue? He just told stories that people enjoyed, and these stories often portrayed gods and heroes acting immorally, providing bad examples that corrupt the audience. Plato does allow that some poetry might be acceptable if it praises the gods and good people and serves the educational goals of the city, but the great tragedians and epic poets, who are most beloved by Greeks, would have to be exiled from the ideal city, despite all their genius and charm. This position seems outrageous to many readers, an example of philosophy's arrogance in claiming to be superior to art, and it seems especially strange coming from Plato himself, who is one of the great literary artists of Western civilization and whose dialogues are masterpieces of dramatic writing. Some scholars have argued that Plato's critique of poetry is not meant to be taken entirely literally, but is rather a provocative challenge to think seriously about the relationship between art and truth, emotion and reason, entertainment and education. Others have seen it as evidence of a deep authoritarian streak in Plato's thought, a willingness to suppress artistic freedom in service of political control and philosophical truth. Others have seen it as evidence of a deep authoritarian streak in Plato's thought, a willingness to suppress artistic freedom in service of political control and philosophical truth. While the Republic focuses primarily on political and ethical questions, several of Plato's dialogues explore what he calls the study of the soul, developing a complex psychology and metaphysics that includes belief in the immortality of the soul and in life after death. These doctrines show the influence of Pythagorean and Orphic religious ideas that were circulating in the Greek world, but Plato transforms these inherited beliefs into systematic philosophical arguments that would profoundly influence later Western thought, particularly after Platonic ideas were absorbed into Christianity. The dialogue Phaedo, set on the last day of Socrates' life as he prepares to drink the hemlock, is primarily devoted to arguments for the immortality of the soul and to a vision of what happens to souls after death. Socrates explains to his grieving friends why a true philosopher should not fear death but should welcome it as the liberation of the soul from the body, as the culmination of a life spent preparing for this final separation. Plato presents several arguments for immortality in the Phaedo, each based on different premises and appealing to different intuitions. One argument from opposites suggests that everything comes to be from its opposite, sleeping from waking, waking from sleeping, life from death, and therefore death from life, implying a cycle in which souls are constantly being reborn. Another argument from recollection claims that our ability to recognize imperfect instances of equality or beauty as equal or beautiful implies that we have prior knowledge of perfect equality or beauty, knowledge that we could not have acquired through sense experience in this life, and therefore must have gained in a previous existence before birth, thus proving that souls existed before they entered bodies. A third argument from affinity suggests that the soul is more like the forms, which are invisible, unchanging, and eternal, than like the body, which is visible, changing, and mortal, and that like goes to like, so the soul naturally survives the death of the body and returns to the realm of eternal realities. A final argument claims that the soul is the principle of life, and cannot admit its opposite, death, and therefore cannot die but must either continue to exist or withdraw when death approaches the body. These arguments have been intensely debated by philosophers, with most modern philosophers finding them logically flawed or based on questionable assumptions, but they represent serious attempts to rationally demonstrate a conclusion that most Greeks, like most people, wanted to believe on emotional grounds. Beyond merely proving immortality, Plato describes the soul's journey after death in a series of myths that combine moral teaching with imaginative vision. In the Phaedo, he describes how souls are judged after death, with the just and philosophically pure souls ascending to a pure realm where they can contemplate truth forever, while the unjust souls are punished in Tartarus or reincarnated in bodies appropriate to their character. Gluttons becoming donkeys, violent people becoming wolves or hawks, ordinary decent people becoming social creatures like bees or ants. The myth emphasizes that our choices in this life determine our fate in the next, that philosophy is practice for death because it trains us to separate the soul from bodily concerns, and that the ultimate goal is to escape the cycle of reincarnation entirely and dwell forever in the realm of pure forms. In the Republic, Plato presents the myth of air, an even more elaborate vision of the afterlife in which souls travel through various regions of the cosmos, witnessing the mechanisms of cosmic justice, choosing their next lives from available options, then drinking from the river of forgetfulness and being reborn. These myths are explicitly presented as myths rather than demonstrated truths, but they convey Plato's deep conviction that the soul is the most important part of us, that caring for the soul is the most important task of life, and that death is not the end of existence, but rather a transition to another form of life. Plato's psychology divides the soul into three parts, as we have seen in the Republic: reason, spirit, and appetite. This tripartite division is illustrated through the famous image of the charioteer controlling two horses, one noble and good, representing spirit, and one ignoble and bad, representing appetite, with reason as the charioteer trying to drive them in the right direction. The three parts can be in harmony or in conflict, and justice in the soul consists in each part performing its proper function, with reason ruling, spirit supporting reason, and appetite being controlled. However, Plato also sometimes speaks of the soul as if it were simply rational, particularly when discussing immortality, and this raises the question of whether the entire tripartite soul is immortal or only the rational part, a question that Plato never clearly answers and that would trouble later Platonists. The Timaeus, one of Plato's later dialogues, presents a cosmological account in which the demiurge or divine craftsman creates the world by imposing order on chaotic matter according to the pattern of eternal forms, and in this process creates immortal rational souls that are then placed in bodies by lesser gods who add the mortal parts of the soul, spirit and appetite. This suggests that only reason is truly immortal, while spirit and appetite are connected to the body and perish with it. But the implications are not fully worked out. The practical implications of these doctrines are clear. We should care for our souls above all else, purifying them from bodily passions and appetites, developing our rational capacities through philosophy, practicing virtue not for the sake of reputation or reward, but because virtue is the health of the soul and vice is its disease. Plato takes seriously the traditional Greek religious concept that the soul can be polluted by wrongdoing and must be purified, but he transforms this ritual concept into a philosophical one, where purification means intellectual and moral development rather than ritual cleansing. The philosopher who truly understands these truths will order his entire life accordingly, caring little for wealth or physical pleasure or worldly success, and caring greatly for wisdom and virtue and the development of the soul. This philosophical way of life is difficult and rare, achievable only by those who have the natural aptitude and receive proper education and maintain discipline throughout their lives. But it offers rewards far greater than anything the world can provide. Knowledge of eternal truth, the well-ordered soul that constitutes genuine happiness, and ultimately escape from the wheel of birth and death into eternal contemplation of reality. Despite his theoretical commitment to philosophy and his skepticism about the possibility of improving actual politics, Plato was drawn back into political involvement through his relationship with Dion and the situation in Syracuse. In 367, Dionysius the Elder died and was succeeded by his son Dionysius the Younger, a man in his 30s who had been raised in his father's court and was accustomed to luxury and flattery, but who had some intellectual pretensions and interests. Dion, who was the young tyrant's uncle by marriage, saw an opportunity to achieve what he and Plato had discussed decades earlier: the education of a ruler in philosophy, so that Syracuse might be transformed from a tyranny into something approaching the ideal city described in the Republic. Dion invited Plato to come to Syracuse and undertake the philosophical education of Dionysius the Younger, presenting this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to put philosophy into practice, to demonstrate that ideas could actually change political reality, to prove that philosophers should be kings or kings should be philosophers. Plato was by this time nearly 60 years old, well established as head of the academy, and might reasonably have declined this invitation and stayed comfortably in Athens, teaching and writing. However, he accepted, apparently motivated by loyalty to Dion, by intellectual curiosity about whether his theories could actually work, and perhaps by ambition to accomplish something that would vindicate philosophy and Socrates' memory. The visit was a disaster almost from the start. Dionysius the Younger was not the ideal student that Plato and Dion had hoped for. He enjoyed philosophical conversations as a kind of intellectual entertainment and liked having a famous philosopher at his court as an ornament of his rule, but he had no real commitment to the serious study and self-discipline that philosophical education requires. Moreover, he was suspicious of Dion's influence and fearful that Dion might be using philosophy as a cover for political ambitions. Courtiers who resented Dion's prominence and Plato's influence played on these fears, whispering accusations and slanders, creating an atmosphere of intrigue and paranoia. Within a few months, Dionysius had exiled Dion on the pretext that he was plotting against the tyranny, though in reality simply to get rid of a rival. Plato found himself in an impossible position, his friend exiled, his student proving unworthy of philosophical education, himself trapped in Syracuse and unable to leave because Dionysius wanted to keep him there while not being willing to actually engage seriously with philosophy. Eventually, Plato managed to extract himself and return to Athens, but only after promising Dionysius that he would return in the future and that he would try to reconcile Dionysius and Dion. Plato did return to Syracuse in 361 for a third and final visit, again at Dionysius's invitation, and again hoping somehow to salvage the situation, to restore Dion to his position and property, and perhaps still to make some progress in philosophical education. This visit was even more disastrous than the second. Dionysius alternated between professing philosophical interests and treating Plato with suspicion and hostility. He made vague promises about restoring Dion, but never actually did anything. He engaged in philosophical discussions, but only superficially, never undertaking the serious mathematical study that Plato insisted was necessary. Eventually, Plato tried to leave, but Dionysius would not let him go, essentially holding him as a prisoner in Syracuse for several months. Plato was finally rescued through the intervention of Archytas of Tarentum, a Pythagorean philosopher and mathematician who was a friend of Plato and who sent a ship to bring him back to safety. The entire Syracuse experiment was finished, and Plato's hope of uniting philosophy and politics in practice had failed utterly. The failure was made even more bitter by what followed. Dion, after years of exile, eventually gathered a military force and invaded Syracuse, briefly establishing himself as ruler only to be assassinated by a supposed friend a few years later. The situation in Syracuse descended into chaos and further tyranny, vindicating Plato's pessimism about the possibility of achieving justice through political action in the real world. Plato himself reflected on these experiences in a long letter, the seventh letter, traditionally included in his collected works. Though scholars debate whether it is genuinely by Plato or by someone writing in his name shortly after his death. The letter, addressed to Dion's friends and supporters, explains Plato's involvement with Syracuse, defends his actions and motives, and offers philosophical reflections on the relationship between philosophy and politics. The author, whoever he was, insists that he went to Syracuse not from ambition, but from loyalty to Dion, and from a sense of duty to at least try to realize the union of philosophy and power, even though he was skeptical about the chances of success. The letter famously declares that there will be no end to the troubles of cities or of humanity itself until either philosophers become kings, or the people who are now called kings and rulers become genuine philosophers, until political power and philosophy are united in the same persons. However, the letter also makes clear that such a union is extraordinarily difficult to achieve and requires many favourable conditions that are rarely if ever present. A naturally gifted individual in a position of power, the opportunity to provide proper philosophical education, the absence of corrupt influences and hostile opposition, and above all, the ruler's genuine commitment to philosophy and virtue rather than merely superficial interest. The Syracuse experience demonstrated that these conditions did not exist there, and perhaps could never exist in any actual political situation, and therefore the philosopher's true calling was not to engage in politics, but to continue the life of study and teaching, hoping that somehow, some day, circumstances might allow philosophy to influence politics in beneficial ways, but not counting on it, or sacrificing philosophical integrity for the sake of political involvement. After the Syracuse disasters, Plato returned to Athens and spent the last decade or more of his life continuing to lead the academy, teaching, engaging in philosophical research, and writing some of his most sophisticated dialogues. The works of this late period show a philosopher who is not merely repeating earlier doctrines, but still thinking, questioning, revising, and exploring new problems. Some of these later dialogues are difficult and technical, addressing specialized problems in metaphysics, logic, and epistemology. Others revisit political themes from a more sober and realistic perspective, trying to think about second-best forms of government rather than ideal cities that will never exist. Throughout, there is a sense that Plato was engaged in ongoing inquiry rather than dogmatic assertion, that he remained true to the Socratic spirit of questioning, even while developing positive doctrines that went far beyond anything Socrates taught. The Parmenides is one of the most challenging dialogues, presenting a series of logical puzzles about the theory of forms that seem designed to show the difficulties inherent in that theory. A young Socrates is questioned by the elderly philosopher Parmenides, who subjects the theory of forms to devastating criticism, asking whether there are forms for everything, including ugly and trivial things, how the relationship of participation between forms and particulars should be understood, whether the forms are one or many, and whether positing forms leads to an infinite regress where we need forms of forms of forms endlessly. Socrates cannot answer these objections adequately, and Parmenides suggests that despite these difficulties, we cannot abandon the forms, because without them thought and language would be impossible. The dialogue then presents a long and extremely abstract exercise in logical reasoning, examining the consequences that follow from assuming that the one is or is not, producing a bewildering series of apparently contradictory conclusions. Scholars have argued for centuries about what this dialogue means. Is it Plato's own self or criticism of his theory of forms? Is it an exercise showing the difficulty of rigorous philosophical reasoning? Is it a warning about the limits of language and logic? Is it a reductio ad absurdum of Parmenides' own philosophy? Whatever the answer, The dialogue shows Plato was willing to confront the most serious objections to his own doctrines and to continue thinking rather than resting on achieved results. The Theaetetus takes up one of the most fundamental questions in philosophy: what is knowledge? The dialogue examines 3 definitions of knowledge, each proposed by the young mathematician Theaetetus, and each subjected to Socratic questioning that reveals its inadequacy. Is knowledge perception? No, because perception gives us only private, momentary, subjective experiences, not the objective, stable truths that knowledge requires. Is knowledge true belief? No, because you might have a true belief by lucky guess or false reasoning, and this would not count as knowledge. Is knowledge true belief with an account or explanation? No, because on examination it is unclear what kind of account would be sufficient, and the dialogue ends in aporia, with no satisfactory definition achieved. Yet the failure is instructive, showing that knowledge is not a simple matter, and that the assumptions most people make about knowledge are deeply confused. The dialogue seems to be preparing the ground for a more adequate account, perhaps one that would invoke the theory of forms, but that positive account is not provided here, leaving the reader to work it out. The sophist and the statesman form a pair of dialogues that examine the nature of sophistry and statesmanship through the method of division, systematically classifying types according to their characteristics. The sophist argues that sophistry is not simply honest ignorance, as Socrates sometimes suggested, but rather a deliberate art of deception, creating false appearances and manipulating opinion for profit. To explain how false statements are possible, the dialogue develops a complex metaphysical and logical theory about being, non-being, sameness, difference, and other fundamental categories. The statesman examines what true statesmanship would be, concluding that it is a kind of expertise in ruling human beings, weaving together different elements of society into a harmonious whole, based on knowledge rather than on law or force or popular support. However, the dialogue acknowledges that such true statesmanship is extremely rare, perhaps impossible, and therefore actual politics requires second-best solutions. Rule of law that restricts what rulers can do, mixed constitutions that balance different elements, and citizen participation that prevents any one person or group from having absolute power. The Philebus investigates the question of whether pleasure or knowledge is the good for human beings, and concludes that neither is sufficient by itself, but that the good life requires a mixture of both, with knowledge and wisdom having priority. The dialogue develops a metaphysical framework based on the categories of limit, unlimited, mixture, and cause, analysing how these principles operate in reality and in the soul. It also classifies pleasures into different types, some pure and some mixed with pain, some true and some false, arguing that not all pleasures are equally good, and that the philosopher's intellectual pleasures are superior to bodily pleasures. The conclusion is a ranking of goods in which wisdom and knowledge come first, followed by proportion and beauty, then by rational pleasures, with bodily pleasures at the bottom. This ranking reflects Plato's consistent position that the rational part of the soul should rule, and that intellectual activities are more valuable than physical ones. But the dialogue acknowledges more clearly than some earlier works that a complete human life requires both elements in proper balance. The Timaeus is Plato's most sustained venture into cosmology, physics, and natural science, presenting a comprehensive account of the origin and structure of the universe and the place of human beings within it. The dialogue is less dramatic than many of Plato's works, consisting largely of a long speech by Timaeus, a Pythagorean astronomer, who presents what is explicitly labelled a likely story, rather than certain truth, acknowledging that accounts of the physical world can never achieve the certainty of accounts of the forms, because the physical world is constantly changing and can only be described approximately. Nevertheless, the Timaeus offers a detailed and systematic vision of reality that would be enormously influential, particularly after it became the only Platonic dialogue widely available in Western Europe during the Middle Ages, and was therefore the primary source through which medieval thinkers encountered Platonic philosophy. The cosmology begins with the demiurge, a divine craftsman who is not omnipotent like the monotheistic God, but rather a rational agent who works with pre-existing materials to create as good a world as possible. The demiurge looks to the eternal forms as his model and tries to make the physical world resemble the forms as closely as the materials allow. He begins by creating the world soul, a rational principle that permeates the entire cosmos and gives it life and order, structuring it according to mathematical ratios that reflect the harmonious patterns of the forms. He creates time as a moving image of eternity, with the regular motions of the heavenly bodies marking out days and years and allowing for measurement and order. He creates the four elements, fire, air, water, and earth, out of geometrical shapes, the most perfect and symmetrical forms that can exist in three-dimensional space, with fire corresponding to the tetrahedron, air to the octahedron, water to the icosahedron, and earth to the cube. These elements can transform into each other because their geometric structures can be broken down and recombined, providing a mathematical account of physical change that anticipates aspects of modern chemistry and physics. The visible cosmos is structured as a sphere, the most perfect shape, with the earth at the centre and the heavenly bodies, including the fixed stars and the wandering planets, moving in circular orbits at different distances and speeds. These celestial motions are not random but are governed by mathematical laws, and the study of astronomy allows human beings to apprehend the rational order of the universe and to harmonize their own souls with the cosmic order. The demiurge creates immortal rational souls and places them in the stars, then assigns lesser gods to create mortal bodies and the mortal parts of the soul, spirit, and appetite. The first incarnation is as a man, but souls that fail to live well may be reincarnated as women or animals depending on the nature of their vice, with cowardly souls becoming women, those who live by unreflective sense perception becoming birds, those who are ignorant of astronomy becoming land animals, and the most mindless becoming fish and shellfish. This hierarchy of reincarnation reflects the profound sexism and anthropocentrism of ancient Greek culture, though we should note that Plato also suggests that souls of any kind can potentially be redeemed through philosophy and ascend back to rational human form and ultimately to pure contemplative existence. The second half of the Timaeus presents a detailed account of human anatomy and physiology, explaining how the body is constructed to serve the soul and how the various organs and systems function. The head is spherical because it houses reason and should resemble the spherical cosmos. The body is cylindrical and equipped with limbs to carry the head around and prevent it from rolling in every direction. The eyes are constructed to emit fire that mixes with daylight, allowing vision, and this same fire is responsible for sleep when it is turned inward at night. The various internal organs each have specific functions related to the soul's needs. The heart is the seat of spirit. The liver serves appetite. The lungs cool the heart. The digestive system processes food. Diseases are explained as imbalances among the elements or disruptions of the proper order of body and soul, and health consists in maintaining proper proportion and harmony. The account is often wildly inaccurate by modern scientific standards, mixing some genuine observations with fantastical speculation, but it represents a serious attempt to explain natural phenomena through rational principles rather than through myth or divine caprice. The Timaeus concludes with a vision of the proper relationship between human beings and the cosmos. We are placed in a beautiful and orderly universe that manifests divine reason, and our task is to study this universe through philosophy and mathematics, to understand its rational structure, and to order our own souls according to the same principles of proportion and harmony that govern the cosmos. By contemplating the regular motions of the heavens and recognizing the mathematical patterns in nature, we align our own thinking with the mind of the demiurge and participate in divine rationality. This contemplative activity is the highest purpose of human life, superior to all political or practical concerns, and those who engage in it successfully will escape the cycle of reincarnation and return to their original star to live in eternal happiness. The Timaeus thus integrates metaphysics, cosmology, physics, biology, psychology, ethics, and religion into a comprehensive system that sees the entire universe as a rational order to which philosophy gives us access, making human reason not an accident or anomaly, but rather a reflection of the divine reason that structured reality itself. Plato's final work, The Laws, is his longest dialogue and also his most realistic and detailed approach to political philosophy, representing a kind of culmination of his lifelong thinking about how human communities can be organized to promote virtue and happiness. Unlike the Republic, which describes an ideal city that Plato admits could probably never exist, The Laws attempts to design a constitution and legal code for a second-best city, one that acknowledges human weakness and limitations, but still tries to embody philosophical principles as far as possible in actual practice. The dialogue imagines three old men, an Athenian stranger who represents Plato's own views, a Spartan named Megillus, and a Cretan named Clinias, who are walking together on a long journey in Crete and spend their time discussing how to found a new colony on Crete with the best possible laws. The discussion ranges over every aspect of political life in enormous detail, from constitutional structures to criminal law, to education, to religion, to property, to marriage, to commerce, to entertainment, producing a comprehensive legal framework that would govern every significant aspect of citizens' lives. The city described in the Laws is different in many important respects from the ideal city of the Republic. There are no philosopher kings ruling with absolute wisdom and authority. Instead, there is a mixed constitution with multiple magistrates and councils and assemblies, checks and balances preventing any individual or group from having too much power. There is no communism of property or family for the ruling class. Instead, all citizens own private property, though the amount is limited, and there are regulations to prevent excessive inequality. Women are educated, but remain in subordinate positions rather than being equal to men, as in the Republic's guardian class. The citizen body numbers 5,040, chosen for mathematical convenience, and is divided into 4 property classes, with political offices and responsibilities distributed according to wealth and merit. Slaves are acknowledged as a necessary evil for doing the manual labour that citizens should not have to perform. Trade and commerce, despised by Plato as morally corrupting, are relegated to non-citizens, while citizens focus on warfare and politics and cultural activities. What makes the City of the Laws distinctive is its extraordinarily detailed regulation of education, culture, and religion, all designed to form citizens of good character who will obey the laws out of genuine conviction rather than fear. Plato insists that laws should have preambles explaining why the law exists and why obedience is good, educating citizens rather than merely commanding them. Education begins in infancy and continues throughout life, with careful attention to the formation of character through music, dance, poetry, and athletics. Only certain kinds of music and stories are permitted, those that encourage virtue and piety and respect for law. Religious festivals and communal activities shape citizens' lives, creating shared experiences and values. Women are included in this common education and in many civic activities because Plato recognizes that excluding half the population from training in virtue is irrational and weakens the city. However, the education is much more conservative than in the Republic, emphasizing traditional virtues and conventional morality rather than radical philosophical inquiry. The goal is not to produce philosophers who question everything, but rather good citizens who obey laws, honor the gods, fulfill their social roles, practice moderate virtue, and maintain the stability and harmony of the community. The Laws also addresses the question of how to deal with religious skepticism and atheism, topics that were obviously important to Plato given Socrates' fate, and given the spread of sophistic teaching that denied the gods or made them irrelevant to human life. Plato argues at length that atheism is false, offering proofs that gods exist, that they care about human affairs, and that they cannot be bribed by sacrifices and prayers. 3 propositions that he sees as essential to genuine religion and public morality. Those who reject these truths are not merely mistaken, but dangerous to society, and the Laws prescribes different punishments for different kinds of religious offenders, ranging from imprisonment and re-education for those who are mistaken but not vicious, to death for those who combine atheism with corrupt manipulation of popular religion. This embrace of religious persecution seems shockingly illiberal to modern readers and contradicts the very spirit of free philosophical inquiry that Socrates embodied, but it reflects Plato's conviction that a stable and virtuous society requires shared religious beliefs, and that those who undermine such beliefs threaten the foundations of communal life. The Laws concludes with the establishment of the Nocturnal Council, a small group of the wisest and most experienced citizens who will meet before dawn to discuss the philosophical foundations of the Laws and to make recommendations for how the Laws might be improved over time. This council represents Plato's acknowledgement that even the best code of written laws will need interpretation and revision, that human affairs are too complex and changeable to be completely regulated by fixed rules, and that ultimately political wisdom requires not just obedience to law, but philosophical understanding of justice and goodness. The Nocturnal Council is as close as the City of the Laws comes to having philosopher kings, but they are advisors rather than rulers. Their function is to preserve and perfect the existing system rather than to exercise direct power, and they must work within the framework of law and constitution rather than transcending it. This represents Plato's mature view that while philosophy is essential to good politics, philosophers cannot simply rule as enlightened despots, but must find ways to influence politics through education, persuasion, and institutional design, accepting the constraints of law and custom while trying gradually to improve them. While Plato was writing his later dialogues and reflecting on the failures of his political interventions, the academy continued to flourish as the leading philosophical institution in the Greek world. Students came from all over to study with Plato and his associates, attracted by the Academy's reputation for excellence in mathematics and philosophy, by Plato's fame as a writer and thinker, and by the opportunity to participate in a community of serious intellectual inquiry. The atmosphere of the Academy was both rigorous and open, combining mathematical study with philosophical debate, formal instruction with informal conversation, research into specific problems with broad speculation about fundamental questions. Different members of the Academy pursued different interests and developed different interpretations of Platonic philosophy, and there was no requirement for orthodox agreement with everything Plato taught. What united the Academy was not dogmatic adherence to doctrines, but rather commitment to rational inquiry, to following arguments wherever they lead, to seeking truth through dialectical examination of competing views. The most famous student at the Academy was Aristotle, who arrived around 367 when he was 17 years old and remained until Plato's death 20 years later. Aristotle would eventually develop his own philosophical system that departed significantly from Plato's in metaphysics, ethics, politics, and many other areas, but he received his initial training at the Academy and remained profoundly influenced by Platonic philosophy even as he criticized and revised it. The relationship between Plato and Aristotle raises fascinating questions about the nature of philosophical education and influence. Plato did not produce a slavish imitator, but rather an independent thinker who took Platonic problems seriously while developing very different solutions. This was surely what Plato wanted. The Academy was meant to produce philosophers capable of thinking for themselves, not disciples who merely repeated the master's words. The fact that Aristotle could study with Plato for 20 years and then develop a rival philosophical system demonstrates both the quality of Platonic education and Plato's own open-minded approach to teaching. Other students would develop still different interpretations, leading eventually to a variety of Platonic schools with competing visions of what Plato really meant and what his philosophy implied for various questions. Beyond its role in educating future philosophers, the Academy also influenced practical affairs through the activities of its members, who served as advisors and lawmakers to various Greek cities. There are records of Academy members being invited to draft constitutions and legal codes, to advise rulers on policy questions, to engage in diplomatic missions, carrying Platonic ideas about education, law, and governance into the real world of Greek politics. These interventions were generally more successful than Plato's own disastrous involvement in Syracuse, perhaps because these younger philosophers had learned from Plato's mistakes and approached politics more cautiously and realistically. The Academy's mathematical work was equally influential, with members making important advances in geometry, astronomy, and mathematical physics that would be built upon by later scientists like Euclid and Archimedes. Plato's insistence that mathematics was essential preparation for philosophy meant that the Academy attracted some of the best mathematical minds of the era and became a centre for cutting-edge mathematical research as well as philosophical speculation. Plato also influenced Athenian cultural and intellectual life more broadly through his writings, which circulated in Athens and beyond, and were read by educated people who never studied at the Academy. The dialogues were literary masterpieces as well as philosophical texts, and they shaped how subsequent writers and thinkers would approach philosophical questions. By creating the philosophical dialogue as a literary form, Plato invented a new way of doing philosophy, one that combined logical argument with dramatic characterization, abstract reasoning with concrete examples, serious inquiry with irony and humour. Later writers would imitate this form, and even those who worked in other genres were influenced by Platonic themes and methods. The image of Socrates that Plato created in the dialogues became the iconic representation of what a philosopher should be, someone who lives for truth rather than for conventional success, who questions everything, including himself, who maintains ethical integrity even unto death, who combines intellectual brilliance with personal simplicity, who uses reason to examine the most fundamental questions about reality and value. This Socratic ideal would inspire philosophers for centuries, providing a model of intellectual courage and moral seriousness that transcended the particular arguments and doctrines Plato developed. Plato died in Athens in 347 or 346 at the age of 80 or 81, after leading the academy for 40 years. Ancient sources give various romantic accounts of his death, claiming that he died peacefully while attending a wedding feast, or that he passed away while writing, the ultimate image of a philosopher working until the last moment. But we have no reliable information about his final days. What matters is that he died having accomplished something unprecedented. He had created an institution dedicated to philosophical education and research that would outlast him. He had written works that would preserve his philosophical vision for future generations. He had trained students who would carry on his work and develop it in new directions. And he had established philosophy as a rigorous discipline with its own methods and standards, rather than merely an activity of isolated individuals asking unsystematic questions. The academy would continue for 9 centuries after Plato's death, surviving through the Hellenistic period when Greek culture spread across the Mediterranean and Near East following Alexander's conquests, through the Roman period when Greek philosophy was absorbed and adapted by Roman intellectuals, and into the late ancient period when Platonism was synthesized with Christianity and other religious traditions to create new philosophical systems. Plato's successor as head of the academy was his nephew Speusippus, who had been a member of the academy for many years, and who would lead it for the next 8 years until his own death. Speusippus interpreted Plato's philosophy in a more mathematical direction, emphasizing the role of numbers and mathematical principles in the structure of reality and downplaying or reinterpreting the theory of forms. This mathematical Platonism would remain influential in later antiquity and would shape how Plato was understood by subsequent generations. After Speusippus came Xenocrates, another long-time member of the academy, who systematized Platonic philosophy and organized it into the 3 traditional divisions of logic, physics, and ethics that would become standard in ancient philosophy. Later heads of the academy would take Platonism in various directions, sometimes emphasizing skepticism and arguing that Plato's real message was that we should question everything and avoid dogmatic assertions, sometimes developing elaborate metaphysical systems based on Platonic principles, sometimes trying to synthesize Plato with other philosophical schools like Stoicism or Aristotelianism. The interpretation of Plato became a major philosophical enterprise in itself, with different schools and thinkers claiming to represent the authentic Platonic tradition. Middle Platonists of the Hellenistic and Roman periods developed doctrines about a hierarchy of divine principles, about demons as intermediary beings between gods and humans, about the relationship between Platonic forms and the divine mind, about ethics as assimilation to God through virtue and philosophical contemplation. Neoplatonists like Plotinus, in the 3rd century of the Common Era, created comprehensive philosophical systems based on Platonic foundations, positing a supreme one that transcends being and thought and from which all reality emanates in a descending hierarchy of levels, from divine intellect contemplating the forms, to world soul animating the cosmos, to nature producing physical things, with the goal of human life being to purify the soul and achieve mystical ascent back to union with the One. This Neoplatonism would become the dominant philosophical system of late antiquity and would profoundly influence Christian, Jewish and Islamic theology and philosophy. The closing of the Academy in 529 by order of the Emperor Justinian, who saw pagan philosophy as a threat to Christian orthodoxy, marked the end of an era, but not the end of Platonic influence. By this time, Platonic ideas had already been thoroughly absorbed into Christian thought through the work of church fathers like Augustine, who had been a Neoplatonist before his conversion to Christianity and who interpreted Christian doctrine through Platonic categories, understanding God as the supreme reality beyond being, the human soul as immortal and seeking return to God, the material world as a reflection of divine ideas, sin as the soul's turn away from eternal truth toward temporal things, and salvation as the soul's redirection toward God through grace. Through Christianity, Platonic ideas would shape the intellectual framework of medieval and early modern Western civilization, influencing everything from theology to politics to art to science. The rediscovery of more of Plato's dialogues during the Renaissance sparked new waves of Platonic enthusiasm and new interpretations that would feed into the development of modern philosophy. To trace the full extent of Plato's influence on Western civilization would require not one narrative, but many volumes, for there are few areas of Western thought and culture that have not been shaped by Platonic ideas in some way. In philosophy, Plato established many of the fundamental questions and conceptual frameworks that would dominate the field for millennia. The question of universals, whether there are real entities corresponding to general terms or only particular things, has been debated continuously since Plato first proposed the theory of forms. The mind-body problem, the question of how immaterial soul or mind relates to material body, derives directly from Platonic dualism. Epistemological debates about the relationship between reason and experience, between a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge, between rationalism and empiricism, all have roots in Platonic discussions of how we know eternal truths that transcend sensory experience. Ethics after Plato would always have to contend with his claim that virtue is knowledge and that there are objective standards of good and bad independent of human conventions and desires. Even if later thinkers rejected these claims, they had to argue against Plato's position. In political philosophy, Plato's influence has been equally profound and controversial. His vision of a society ruled by wise philosophers who govern for the common good rather than their own interest has inspired countless political thinkers and reformers who have sought to create systems where knowledge and virtue determine political power rather than wealth or birth or popular appeal. At the same time, his critique of democracy and his willingness to sacrifice individual freedom for communal good and philosophical truth have made him a favourite target of liberal and democratic thinkers who see in the Republic a blueprint for totalitarianism. Karl Popper's influential book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, famously attacked Plato as an enemy of the open society, arguing that Platonic philosophy leads inevitably to authoritarian politics. Other scholars have defended Plato, arguing that his political thought is more nuanced and less authoritarian than critics suggest, that his primary concern was moral education rather than political control, that his ideal city was meant as a standard for evaluating actual cities rather than a practical blueprint for revolution. These debates demonstrate that Plato remains a living presence in political thought, not a dead historical figure, but an active participant in ongoing arguments about justice, freedom, equality, and the proper organization of human communities. In theology and religion, Platonic influence on Christianity and other monotheistic traditions has been immense and complex. Plato's conception of a realm of eternal perfect realities beyond the changing physical world fit naturally with religious ideas of heaven or paradise as the true reality compared to which earthly existence is merely temporary and imperfect. His description of the soul as immortal and as the true self that survives death harmonized with Christian beliefs about personal immortality and resurrection. His ethical teaching that we should purify the soul from bodily passions and seek knowledge of eternal truth mapped readily onto Christian asceticism and mysticism. The Neoplatonic idea of a hierarchy, of being descending from a supreme one, was adapted to understand the relationship between God, angels, and creation. However, this synthesis of Plato and Christianity also created tensions, particularly regarding the status of the material world, which Platonism tended to devalue as inferior to the spiritual realm, while Christianity insisted on the goodness of creation and the redemption of the body as well as the soul. Medieval scholastic philosophers like Thomas Aquinas would attempt to balance Platonic and Aristotelian elements in Christian theology, while later Protestant reformers would sometimes reject Platonic influences as corruptions of pure biblical religion. In aesthetics and art theory, Plato's views have been paradoxically influential, despite his own hostility toward poetry and art. His critique of art as imitation, his emphasis on ideal beauty rather than particular beautiful objects, his idea that true art should serve moral and educational purposes rather than merely providing pleasure, these themes have been debated and adapted by centuries of artists and critics. The concept of ideal beauty, of perfect forms that actual beautiful things approximate, has inspired artists to seek not mere realistic representation, but rather idealized versions that capture essential qualities. The tension Plato identified between sensory pleasure and rational understanding, between emotional engagement and intellectual apprehension, continues to shape debates about what art is and what it should do. Even those who reject Platonic conclusions have to engage with Platonic questions about the relationship between art and truth, beauty and morality, emotion and reason. In education, Plato's vision of a systematic curriculum progressing from mathematics to philosophy, of education as formation of character, and not merely transmission of information, of different kinds of knowledge requiring different kinds of teaching. These ideas have shaped Western educational theory and practice, from the founding of medieval universities to modern liberal arts education. The conviction that education should develop the whole person, training body as well as mind, emotion as well as reason, character as well as intellect, derives in large part from Platonic philosophy. The idea of the university as a community of scholars pursuing truth through research and teaching rather than merely training people for careers or professions reflects the model of Plato's academy. The contemporary emphasis on critical thinking, on learning how to question and argue rather than simply memorizing facts, continues the Socratic tradition of dialectical education that Plato recorded and advocated. As Western thought moved into the modern period, Plato remained a crucial reference point even as philosophy underwent transformations that took it far from ancient Greek concerns. Renaissance humanists rediscovered many Platonic texts that had been lost or neglected during the Middle Ages and found in them inspiration for a renewed emphasis on human dignity and potential, for integration of classical learning with Christian faith, for the pursuit of wisdom through study of ancient texts. The Platonic Academy of Florence, founded by Marsilio Ficino in the 15th century, translated Plato's complete works into Latin and developed a Christianized Neoplatonism that influenced Renaissance art, literature, and philosophy. Artists like Michelangelo absorbed Platonic ideas about beauty as a ladder ascending toward divine reality, and Renaissance love poetry drew on Platonic concepts of love as desire for transcendent beauty mediated through particular beautiful individuals. In the early modern period, rationalist philosophers like Descartes and Leibniz were profoundly influenced by Platonic epistemology, particularly the idea that reason can discover necessary truths independent of sensory experience. Descartes' famous cogito argument that even if everything else is doubtful, I cannot doubt that I exist as a thinking being, echoes Platonic emphasis on the priority of mind over matter and reason over sensation. His ontological argument for God's existence, reasoning from the idea of a perfect being to the necessary existence of that being, employs the distinctively Platonic move from concepts to reality. Leibniz's theory of monads as simple substances that mirror the universe from different perspectives, and his doctrine of pre-established harmony reflect Platonic ideas about unity, underlying multiplicity, and rational order pervading reality. Even empiricist critics of rationalism, like Locke and Hume, had to define their positions against Platonic claims about innate ideas and a priori knowledge, making Plato a permanent part of the epistemological debate. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries found in Plato a source for its own emphasis on emotion, imagination, and transcendence. Poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge drew on Platonic ideas about the soul's pre-existence and its fall into the material world, interpreting childhood as a state of greater spiritual awareness that is gradually lost as we become absorbed in worldly concerns. Shelley wrote that we are all Greeks, meaning that Greek culture, and particularly Platonic philosophy, represented an ideal of human potential that modernity should try to recover. The Romantic conception of the poet as a visionary who apprehends truths beyond ordinary perception owes much to Plato's image of the philosopher escaping the cave and seeing reality by the light of the sun. Though Romantics typically valued poetic imagination more highly than philosophical reason in contrast to Plato's own views. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Plato continued to inspire and provoke philosophers working in very different traditions. German idealists like Hegel saw themselves as completing the Platonic project of understanding reality as the self-development of rational spirit, though they criticized Plato for keeping form separate from the material world rather than understanding how the ideal realizes itself through history. Existentialists like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche vehemently rejected Platonic philosophy, attacking it as life-denying, as privileging abstract reason over concrete existence, as creating illusory worlds beyond this one to compensate for inability to accept and affirm the only reality we actually have. Nietzsche particularly savaged Plato as the archetypal decadent, who turned away from life and health and power toward imaginary ideals of truth and goodness and beauty, diagnosing Platonism as a disease that had infected Western civilization for 2,000 years. Yet even this passionate rejection demonstrated Plato's continuing importance. Nietzsche devoted enormous energy to attacking Platonic philosophy because he saw it as the foundation of everything he wanted to overcome, making Plato the necessary antagonist in Nietzsche's project of revaluing all values. 20th century analytical philosophy engaged extensively with Platonic texts and arguments, subjecting them to logical analysis and debating their validity with modern philosophical tools. Philosophers like Bertrand Russell and G. E. Moore took seriously Platonic questions about universals and abstract objects, developing sophisticated theories about the ontological status of numbers, propositions, properties, and other entities that seem to be neither physical nor mental. Ludwig Wittgenstein's early work in the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus employed a quasi-Platonic picture theory of meaning where propositions picture facts by sharing logical form with them, though his later work rejected this picture and argued that meaning arises from use in social contexts rather than from correspondence to eternal forms. Contemporary metaphysicians continue to argue about whether there are universals, whether mathematical objects exist independently of human thought, whether moral truths are objective or subjective, all questions that Plato was the first to formulate clearly and systematically. In our own time, Plato remains remarkably present in both academic philosophy and broader culture, continuing to generate new interpretations and applications more than 2 millennia after his death. Contemporary academic philosophy includes a substantial subfield devoted specifically to ancient Greek philosophy, with Plato as its central figure, and major universities around the world employ specialists who spend their careers interpreting Platonic texts, analysing Platonic arguments, and debating what Plato meant and whether his positions are defensible. New translations of the dialogues continue to appear, each trying to capture nuances of Plato's Greek and to make his thought accessible to modern readers. Scholarly journals publish hundreds of articles on Platonic philosophy every year, examining everything from technical problems in the theory of forms to the literary structure of the dialogues to the historical context of Plato's thought to applications of Platonic ideas to contemporary issues. This ongoing scholarly engagement demonstrates that Plato is not simply a historical monument to be studied respectfully from a distance, but rather a living interlocutor whose arguments can still challenge and provoke, whose questions are still our questions, whose insights can still illuminate problems we face today. Beyond academic philosophy, Platonic ideas have filtered into contemporary culture in various ways, sometimes explicitly recognized and sometimes not. The language of Platonic ideals, of perfect forms that actual things approximate, appears constantly in ordinary speech when people talk about the ideal vacation, or the perfect partner, or justice itself, implicitly invoking the Platonic distinction between imperfect particulars and perfect archetypes. The concept of Platonic love, referring to a deep non-sexual relationship, derives from Plato's Symposium and its account of how love for an individual, beautiful person can become a ladder to love of beauty itself, though the modern usage has lost most of the metaphysical framework that gave the original concept meaning. The allegory of the cave has become a cultural icon, referenced in everything from The Matrix to political speeches to self-help books, used to express the idea that most people live in illusion and that enlightenment requires difficult and often unwelcome recognition of uncomfortable truths. These popularizations often simplify or distort Plato's actual views, but they demonstrate the power of his images and ideas to speak to people far removed from ancient Greece in time and culture. Platonic philosophy has also been applied to contemporary ethical and political issues in interesting ways. Some bioethicists have drawn on Platonic ideas about the soul and human nature to argue for or against genetic engineering, enhancement technologies, and other interventions that might fundamentally alter what human beings are. Some environmentalists have used Platonic metaphysics to argue for the intrinsic value of nature independent of human interests, suggesting that species and ecosystems have a kind of formal reality that grounds moral obligations toward them. Some critics of contemporary consumer culture have employed Platonic arguments against excessive concern with material goods and bodily pleasures, urging people to focus instead on cultivation of the soul through education, philosophy, and pursuit of genuine rather than apparent goods. Some educational reformers have advocated for more Platonic approaches to teaching that emphasize character formation and pursuit of truth rather than merely training for careers and acquisition of marketable skills. These applications are selective and often controversial, but they show that Platonic philosophy still has resources for thinking about how we should live and how society should be organized. The dialogue form that Plato invented has also remained influential in Western literature and thought, serving as a model for countless later works that use conversation to explore ideas. From Cicero's philosophical dialogues in ancient Rome, to medieval disputations, to Renaissance humanist dialogues, to modern philosophical fictions like those of Iris Murdoch or Rebecca Goldstein, writers have found that dramatizing philosophical discussion through conversation between characters allows for exploration of multiple perspectives and for engagement of readers in active thinking rather than passive reception of doctrines. The Socratic method of teaching through questions rather than through lectures has been institutionalized in law schools and some other educational settings, and it remains an ideal, if not always a reality, in liberal arts education. The figure of Socrates, as portrayed by Plato, the wise teacher who professes ignorance and whose questions force students to think for themselves, continues to represent an educational ideal against which actual teaching practices can be measured. In the realm of mathematics and science, Platonic philosophy of mathematics remains a live option, defended by many contemporary mathematicians and philosophers who believe that mathematical objects like numbers and sets really exist independently of human minds and physical reality, that mathematical truths are discovered rather than invented, that the applicability of mathematics to physical reality is evidence that reality itself has a mathematical structure. This modern Platonism has to answer difficult questions about how we can have knowledge of abstract objects that exist outside space and time, and that cannot causally interact with us. But it captures the sense that many mathematicians and scientists have that they are investigating an objective reality rather than simply manipulating symbols according to arbitrary rules. Physicists working on fundamental theories sometimes invoke Platonic ideas about mathematics as the deep structure of reality, suggesting that physical laws are not contingent facts about our particular universe, but necessary truths reflecting the mathematical forms that any universe must instantiate. What explains Plato's extraordinary longevity and continued relevance more than 2,300 years after his death in a world that would be utterly unrecognizable to him. Part of the answer surely lies in the fundamental nature of the questions he asked. When Plato, through Socrates, questions what justice is, what knowledge is, what the good life is, what reality ultimately consists of, he is not asking questions that belong only to ancient Athens or classical Greece, but rather questions that arise naturally for any thoughtful person trying to make sense of existence and trying to figure out how to live well. These questions cannot be definitively answered once and for all, because they arise from the basic structures of human experience and consciousness, from our awareness of the gap between how things are and how they ought to be, from our ability to think about abstract concepts and universal truths, from our capacity to question ourselves and the world around us. As long as human beings wonder whether the life they are living is the best life available to them, as long as we ask whether our beliefs are really knowledge or merely opinion, as long as we try to distinguish justice from mere power or convention, we will be asking Platonic questions even if we do not know we are doing so. Moreover, Plato's way of addressing these questions through dialogue and dialectical argument, presenting multiple perspectives and subjecting them to a critical examination, invites readers to participate actively in philosophical thinking rather than merely receiving doctrines passively. The Platonic dialogues are not textbooks laying out a system, but rather dramatic philosophical investigations that draw readers into the process of questioning and reasoning, that demonstrate how to think philosophically rather than simply what to think. This pedagogical approach means that each generation of readers can discover Plato anew, can work through the arguments for themselves, can agree or disagree with Socrates' conclusions while still learning from the method he employs. The dialogues remain fresh because they are open-ended explorations rather than closed systems, because they show philosophy as an activity of inquiry rather than a set of fixed results, because they embody the Socratic conviction that recognizing your own ignorance is the beginning of wisdom and that unexamined opinions are not worth holding. The literary and dramatic quality of Plato's writing also contributes to his lasting appeal. Unlike most philosophical texts which are dry and technical, the dialogues are vivid and entertaining, populated by memorable characters with distinct personalities, full of humour and irony and emotional power, employing myths and metaphors and images that engage the imagination as well as the intellect. Readers remember the image of the cave or the metaphor of the charioteer and horses, or the story of the ring of Gyges, or the speech of Alcibiades in the Symposium, or the death of Socrates in the Phaedo. And these memorable passages convey philosophical insights in ways that purely abstract argument never could. Plato understood that human beings are not purely rational creatures, and that effective teaching must engage the whole person, emotions, and imagination, as well as logical reasoning, and he created a form of philosophical writing that accomplishes this integration brilliantly. This is why the dialogues continue to be read not just by philosophy professors, but by general educated readers who find in them not just arguments, but wisdom, not just logical analysis, but vision, not just problems, but inspiration. There is also something in Plato's combination of idealism and realism that continues to resonate. He insists that there are objective truths about justice and goodness and beauty, that these are not merely matters of opinion or convention or individual preference, that philosophy can discover eternal realities that transcend the flux and confusion of ordinary experience. This idealistic vision offers hope that human life is not meaningless chaos, that our deepest intuitions about right and wrong are not illusions, that wisdom and virtue are real possibilities and not just empty words. At the same time, Plato is grimly realistic about how difficult it is to achieve knowledge and virtue, about how resistant people are to philosophical examination, about how corrupt and unjust actual political systems are, about how rare and fragile genuine wisdom is. He does not offer easy answers or comforting illusions, but rather insists that the philosophical life requires tremendous effort and courage, and will often be rejected and persecuted by society. This combination of soaring idealism about what is possible with stark realism about how difficult it is to achieve speaks to something deep in human experience. The tension between our aspirations toward truth and goodness and beauty and the hard realities of ignorance and vice and ugliness that we constantly encounter. To give a complete picture of Plato's legacy, we must also acknowledge the serious criticisms that have been levelled against his philosophy from his own time to ours. Aristotle, his greatest student, systematically attacked the theory of forms, arguing that it fails to explain change and causation in the physical world, that it multiplies entities unnecessarily by positing a separate form for every general term, that the relationship of participation between forms and particulars is incoherent and merely metaphorical, that Platonic philosophy wrongly divorces form from matter when in reality they are inseparable aspects of concrete things. Aristotle's critique established patterns of argument that would be repeated by later critics, that Platonic philosophy is too abstract and otherworldly, that it fails to account for the reality and value of the physical world and bodily existence, that it cannot explain how knowledge of transcendent forms is possible or relevant to actual life, that it substitutes metaphysical speculation for careful empirical observation. Plato's political philosophy has been attacked from multiple directions as both too radical and too conservative, as both authoritarian and impractical. Critics on the left have objected to Plato's acceptance of slavery, his assumption that most people are incapable of rational self-government, his willingness to use censorship and propaganda to control citizens' beliefs, his defence of inequality as natural and necessary, his elevation of unity and stability over freedom and diversity. Critics on the right have objected to his communism of property and family for the guardian class, his insistence on radical equality between men and women in that class, his rejection of tradition and conventional morality in favour of philosophical reason, his confidence that a properly educated elite could redesign society according to rational principles. Liberal critics have objected to his disregard for individual rights and liberties, his willingness to subordinate individuals to the state, his belief that those with superior wisdom should rule over others for their own good even against their will, seeing in all this the seeds of totalitarianism. And practical people have pointed out that Plato's ideal city is purely theoretical and could never actually exist, that his philosopher kings are impossible fantasies, that his entire political philosophy is the work of an ivory tower intellectual with no real understanding of politics or human nature. Plato's epistemology has been criticised for creating an unbridgeable gap between two realms of reality, with forms existing in some transcendent space while physical things exist in the ordinary world, and no coherent account of how we can have knowledge of forms, or how forms can explain anything about physical reality. Empiricist critics argue that all knowledge ultimately derives from sensory experience, and that Plato's theory of innate ideas and a priori knowledge of forms is a myth. Naturalist critics argue that Plato's dualism of mind and body, soul and matter, is incoherent, and that consciousness and thought must be explained through the physical processes of the brain rather than through an immaterial soul that somehow inhabits and controls a body. Contemporary cognitive scientists studying how human beings actually acquire concepts and make judgments have found little support for Platonic theories of recollection or direct intuition of eternal forms, instead showing that our thinking is shaped by embodied interaction with physical and social environments, that concepts are formed through pattern recognition and abstraction from experience, that there is no access to transcendent realities but only to the empirical world as mediated by our sensory and cognitive apparatus. Plato's views on art and poetry have been widely rejected as Philistine and authoritarian, an example of philosophy's arrogance in claiming superiority over all other modes of human expression and understanding. Artists and literary critics have argued that art does not merely imitate appearances, but rather reveals truths that cannot be expressed in abstract philosophical discourse. That emotional engagement with tragic drama or poetry or painting can be morally and intellectually valuable rather than corrupting. That censorship of art in the name of moral education is a cure worse than the disease, stifling creativity and freedom and ultimately impoverishing rather than enriching human life. The romantic and modern elevation of artistic genius and creative imagination stands in direct opposition to Plato's subordination of art to philosophy and his dismissal of poets as mere imitators dealing in illusions. Feminist critics have pointed out the deep sexism in much of Plato's thought despite his apparently progressive inclusion of women in the guardian class of the Republic. Plato consistently describes the female as inferior to the male, suggesting that being reborn as a woman is a punishment for failure in a previous life, using female as a standard term of insult, associating women with the body and matter and emotion, while associating men with mind and form and reason. And his proposal that women guardians should receive the same education and perform the same roles as men is motivated not by respect for women as such, but by utilitarian calculation that the city should use all available talent, regardless of gender, and it applies only to the small elite class, while presumably leaving the vast majority of women in traditional subordinate positions. Moreover, the abolition of the family and private property for guardians means abolishing precisely the domestic sphere that was the traditional female realm in Greek society, assimilating women to male roles rather than valuing distinctively female experiences and capabilities. Looking back over the entire arc of Plato's life and influence, we see a figure whose significance cannot be captured in any simple summary. He was a man of multiple contradictions, an aristocrat who rejected wealth and power, a brilliant writer who distrusted poetry, an idealist who experienced bitter political failures, a rationalist who used myths and images, a teacher who claimed to have nothing to teach, a philosopher who believed philosophy should rule, but who saw philosophers persecuted and killed. He lived through some of the most turbulent decades in Athenian history, witnessing the decline and defeat of the city that had been the greatest power in Greece, watching democracy collapse into tyranny and tyranny into civil war, seeing his beloved teacher executed on false charges. These experiences of war and political chaos and injustice shaped his philosophy profoundly, driving him to ask what real justice would look like, whether there could be any stable knowledge in a world of constant change, whether human communities could be organized rationally rather than through force and deception and mob rule. His response to these challenges was to create a comprehensive philosophical vision that addressed metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, psychology, education, aesthetics, and cosmology, showing how all these dimensions of human existence were interconnected and grounded in eternal realities beyond the flux of temporal affairs. The theory of forms provided a metaphysical foundation for objective knowledge and values. The tripartite soul provided a psychological model for understanding human motivation and moral development. The ideal city provided a political vision of justice and harmony. The educational curriculum provided a practical path from ignorance to wisdom. The cosmology of the Timaeus provided a framework for understanding human beings' place in an ordered universe. This systematic ambition, the attempt to develop a total philosophical account of reality and human life within it, set a standard and a challenge for all subsequent philosophy in the Western tradition. Even those who rejected Platonic doctrines had to develop alternative, comprehensive visions, and even those who eschewed systematic philosophy altogether had to explain why Plato's systematic approach was misguided. The founding of the Academy was perhaps Plato's most important practical achievement, creating an institutional framework for philosophical education and research that would outlast him by centuries, and that would serve as a model for all future educational institutions in the Western world. Before Plato, philosophy was primarily the activity of individuals or small informal groups. After Plato, it became an institutionalized discipline with established methods, recognized authorities, canonical texts, and structured curricula. The Academy brought together the best minds of the Greek world to pursue truth collectively through debate and research, combining teaching with original investigation, integrating mathematics with philosophy, maintaining standards of rigor and seriousness while encouraging independent thinking and disagreement. This combination of features, obvious though it may seem to us who have inherited it, was revolutionary in its time and created a new kind of intellectual community. Plato's literary achievement in creating the philosophical dialogue as a genre cannot be overstated. By putting philosophy into dramatic form, by creating vivid characters who argue and question and sometimes become angry or confused or overwhelmed, by using humour and irony and myth alongside logical argumentation, by leaving many dialogues open-ended without definitive conclusions, Plato created texts that engage readers far more effectively than abstract treatises could ever do. The dialogues show philosophy as a living activity rather than a dead system, as something you do rather than something you learn, as a conversation that continues across centuries with each new reader potentially becoming a participant. The figure of Socrates, as Plato presents him, questioning everything and everyone including himself, maintaining integrity and courage in the face of death, dedicated to truth above all else, became the permanent icon of what a philosopher should be and continues to inspire people to think critically and live authentically. Yet Plato's legacy is complex and contested rather than simply positive or negative. His ideas have been used to justify both progressive reforms and reactionary politics, both religious faith and secular rationalism, both artistic creation and artistic censorship, both educational excellence and educational elitism. Different readers and different ages have found different things in Plato, sometimes radically disagreeing about what he meant or whether his ideas are valuable or dangerous. This multiplicity of interpretations is partly due to the dialogical form of Plato's writing, which presents multiple voices and perspectives without always clearly indicating which one represents Plato's own view. It is also due to the breadth and depth of Plato's thought, which touches on so many fundamental questions and which can be approached from so many different angles. and it is due to the simple fact that great philosophical works are inexhaustible, that each generation can find new meanings and new applications in them, that they remain alive precisely because they are complex enough to support multiple readings and to continue provoking thought rather than foreclosing it. In the end, the story of Plato is the story of the birth of philosophy itself in its Western form, the moment when human thinking about fundamental questions became systematic and rigorous, when argument and logic became the standards for evaluating claims about reality and value, when reason was elevated as the supreme human faculty capable of discovering eternal truths. Before Plato, there were of course people who thought deeply about the world and human life. But with Plato, philosophy became something new, a distinct discipline with its own methods and goals, a vocation requiring special training and dedication, a way of life centered on the pursuit of wisdom, the Socratic challenge to question everything, to demand definitions and logical consistency, to prefer truth over comfort or convention, became through Plato's writings the foundation of the Western intellectual tradition. Plato's faith that reason can discover objective truths about justice and goodness and reality, that there are permanent standards beyond the flux of opinion and appearance, that knowledge rather than mere belief is possible, that the life of the mind is the highest human activity. These convictions have shaped Western civilization profoundly, even when they have been challenged or rejected. The scientific revolution of the modern era, with its confidence that nature operates according to mathematical laws that human reason can discover, reflects Platonic assumptions about the rationality of the cosmos and the power of mathematical thinking. The democratic ideals of justice and human rights, even when they oppose Platonic elitism, reflect his insistence that there are objective moral truths that must be respected regardless of what the majority prefers. The university system, with its ideal of liberal education producing well-rounded individuals capable of critical thinking rather than merely technical training for jobs, embodies Platonic vision of education as formation of the whole person. The conviction that truth matters and that we should follow arguments wherever they lead, even if the conclusions are uncomfortable or unpopular, derives from the Socratic Platonic tradition of intellectual integrity and courage. Yet Plato also represents a permanent challenge and provocation, refusing to let us rest comfortably in conventional opinions or unexamined assumptions. His questions about justice and knowledge and goodness remain unanswered, or rather, each generation must answer them again for itself, because these are not questions that can be settled once and for all, but rather questions that arise from the very nature of human existence and self-consciousness. Reading Plato today, more than 2 millennia after he wrote, we find that his questions are still our questions, that Socrates' method of questioning still exposes the contradictions and confusions in our thinking, that the allegory of the cave still describes our tendency to mistake shadows for reality and to resist enlightenment when it is offered. This timeless quality does not mean that Plato provided final answers that remain valid forever, but rather that he identified fundamental problems that every thinking person must grapple with, and that he developed approaches to these problems that remain valuable even when we ultimately disagree with his conclusions. The image that best captures Plato's enduring significance is perhaps his own allegory of the cave. We are all prisoners, watching shadows on the wall, mistaking images for reality, trapped in our limited perspectives and unexamined assumptions. Philosophy is the difficult journey out of the cave into the light of truth, a journey that requires courage and effort and willingness to abandon comfortable illusions. Most people will never make this journey and will resist or mock those who try. The philosopher who achieves enlightenment and returns to help others will often be rejected and may even be killed, as Socrates was. Yet the journey must be attempted because the unexamined life is not worth living, because truth matters more than comfort, because the health of the soul depends on knowledge and virtue, rather than on wealth or pleasure or power. This vision of philosophy as a transformative practice, as a journey from darkness to light, that changes not just what you know, but who you are, remains Plato's most powerful legacy. Whether or not we accept his specific doctrines about forms or souls, or ideal cities, we can recognize in his work a permanent call to think more deeply, to question more honestly, to seek wisdom rather than mere success, to care for our souls rather than merely pursuing external goods. Plato died more than 23 centuries ago, but in a profound sense he has never died. His words continue to speak to us with undiminished power. His questions continue to challenge us. His vision of philosophy as the highest human calling continues to inspire those who seek truth and wisdom. His academy may have closed 1500 years ago, but every university and college where people gather to pursue knowledge through rational inquiry is a descendant of that first academy in the grove of Academus outside Athens. Every person who pauses in the midst of daily concerns to ask what justice really is, or whether the way they are living their life is the best way, or whether their beliefs are really knowledge or merely prejudice, is engaging in the Socratic Platonic enterprise of philosophical examination. In this sense, Plato's story does not end with his death, or even with the closing of his academy, or with any particular historical moment, but continues as long as human beings wonder about truth and justice, and beauty, and reality, as long as we refuse to accept conventional wisdom without examination, as long as we maintain the conviction that there is something higher and more important than material success, or physical pleasure, or popular approval. This is the eternal legacy of Plato, the philosopher whose question about justice in ancient Athens opened a conversation that is still continuing, a conversation in which we are all, whether we know it or not, participants.